Okay, let's get started. My name is Doug Sarno. I'm an independent facilitator, and I've been working with a team of folks to help design this meeting tonight and make sure we've arrived at a place where all of you can have your questions heard, have information received in a way that's understandable, that's complete, that gives you what you need in terms of the questions you're asking right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this meeting was designed, who was involved in the design, what that means in terms of how we're going to operate tonight. First, I have to do the most important thing of the evening, or I will get in big trouble. The fire exits are through the doors that you came in through, and also through this door over here. We won't be taking a formal break, so if you do need to use the restrooms, by all means, you're free to. Through that side exit door, just around the corner to the right, are the restrooms. Other than that, we are going to go probably right through the allotted time at 10 o'clock. We have to be moving toward the doors and out the doors no later than 10:30. So we're going to use that period. If we need to go over 5 or 10 minutes, we can do that, but we can't go much past that. Our goal for tonight is to really explain what is known and what is not yet known about ethylene oxide and the potential risks from ETO from the Willowbrook facility. We recognize how important this information is to you. We recognize how important and how concerned the community is around the risks associated with this site. And we want to make sure that you're getting the information you need and that we're providing accurate, clear, and complete information as much as is currently available. We also know that it can be frustrating to find this information, and it's sometimes kind of hard to know what information to trust and not to trust. And so we really want to hope that this meeting begins to create a platform of information for you to know where to go, an important step in providing that information and linking us to a process forward with EPA and with other agencies so that you know that you're part of a process moving forward, you know where to go for information, you know the people that are involved in this process and working to get us to some conclusion. To that end, this meeting was designed with help from the community, talking to the community, and it's really designed around community questions. Over the past 6 weeks or so, EPA has been involved in weekly conference calls with different stakeholders, different members of the community, different agencies at the state and local level, to hear their concerns, to talk about what's important to them, and to help use that information to design this meeting. Our meeting's organized around those questions. We'll start with some basic welcome and introductions from the village of Willowbrook, from EPA, from some state and federal representatives. There will be a community statement from the Stop Sterigenics group, and then EPA will provide an overview of where we are, how we got here, and what's happening right now in this process. Then representatives from EPA, Illinois EPA, and the Tri-State Fire Department will answer questions directly as posed by the community. We have a wonderful panel of experts here that are going to come up and answer these questions from the different agencies. We also have a great group of volunteers from the community who volunteered to ask the questions that were posed by the community and engage with the panels as we move forward. Those questions have been organized into 3 different topics, which that slide seems to have disappeared. So I will read them to you. The first panel is community questions related to ethylene oxide and what we know and don't know about the risks around the Sterigenics facilities. The second is that we'll ask community questions related to the Sterigenics Willowbrook facility itself. And third, questions related to future plans to inform and engage the community surrounding the Willowbrooks facility. And then at the end, we will reserve a little bit of time to address some questions that didn't fit into any of those topics, and questions that were generated today through the open house. A number of people filled out question cards, and questions we've received since Monday when we had set the deadline for the original input of questions. So we have another panel that is, Christy, you're... Yeah, sorry. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. We'll have that final panel again, ask questions, and they will ask anyone up at the front of the room who is a resource person to this process. We received well over 200 questions, and we've spent the last week really trying to organize those questions, put them into organized topics, prioritize them, and our panelists have helped prioritize them in ways that will address and respond to community's concerns and issues. We're not going to get to every one of those 200 questions tonight. We are prioritizing them. We are putting them in an order so that we will get to the ones that we believe, and the community is helping us get to the ones that are most important to you. Some of the questions don't have answers right now. We recognize that. Those questions will still be asked, but we'll explain why those answers don't exist yet, and what we're doing to hopefully find those answers in the coming weeks and months. Other questions we might not get to because of time. But let me assure you that if you email the question into the EPA, you will receive an email response. You will get a written response to your question personally and directly. We will also in the coming weeks post online a summary of the answers to the questions that were received and discussed tonight, and some of the questions that we did not get to. But it is EPA's intent to answer all of the key relevant questions in writing, but that will take a little bit of time. As you can see, there's a camera here. Tonight's meeting is being live streamed on Facebook. That video will also be made available in the coming weeks online, as was the meeting in August. So if you are moving around, please just try to not walk in front of the camera as the panelists are going. We'll also talk about and learn about EPA's plans to continue this conversation moving forward. This is an ongoing process, and as more information becomes available, EPA is committed to...
Your mouth is different than my mouth.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
We're facilitators, not technical experts, obviously, so sorry about that. Where were we? So we recognize there's a lot of passion in this room, there's a lot of energy. You're hungry for information, so we want to move on. The only ask we really have of you is to treat the folks who are on the stage and treat your fellow citizens who volunteered to ask the questions, and respect the folks who are around you who want to listen with respect, so that we can all hear what's going on, we can listen and make sure that the questions get asked and the answers get heard. As I said, we'll be out of here by 10 p.m. We're going to try to use the time between now and then as effectively as we can. So again, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you in advance for showing that respect to your fellow attendees here tonight. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to Mayor Trilla to welcome us to Willowbrook here tonight.
Some 90 days ago, we changed as a village. We were informed that something was here that we weren't aware of. I'm not going to talk for a long time. I'm not your typical politician. I'd rather hear the scientists talk. So I'm going to be brief. All I want to know is, are my people safe? Was there a danger before? Are we in danger now? And are we going to be in danger in the future? And I'm counting on the EPA to let us know the answer to those three simple questions, and to provide the task that is in the title of their name to help us protect our village.
Thank you, Mayor Triller. I'd now like to ask Jim Payne to come forward. He's the Deputy Regional Administrator for EPA Region 5.
Thank you, Doug. I'm very glad to be making an introduction here in just a moment. And again, my name is Jim Payne. I serve as acting deputy for Kathy Stepp, who is the regional administrator for EPA's Midwest office here in Chicago. She is unfortunately in DC with some matters. However, some here may recall that at the prior public meeting, Kathy Stepp on this stage said, "We will stick with this community." And EPA has had regular briefings with local state elected officials, provided updates regularly to stakeholders, a web page with updated information, and tonight we'll hear more about activities since the last public meeting. Again, I'd like to welcome everyone here. Thank you for coming. And as part of this public meeting, we asked the top air official in the country to come and speak with you. And it is with much pleasure and appreciation that I introduce to you that top air official, Bill Wareham.
Good evening. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone for showing up tonight. The attendance is just fantastic. I walked into the room much earlier today and looked at all the seats and looked at the size, and I thought, we're never going to fill this room. And I think we have standing room only. So I think that says a lot about the level of concern that exists in the community. I think it says a lot about the commitment that there is in this community to understand what's going on and the commitment to try to get to a solution. And that's why I'm here tonight, and that's why several key members of my team in my office are here tonight. So as Jim said, and I'll just repeat, my title is Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation at US EPA. What that means is I'm responsible for all federal air programs. So I am, in fact, the top federal air official in the country. The very first thing I wanted to say to you is we care very much about what is happening here. We know for ourselves that there are emissions of ethylene oxide from the Sterigenics facility. Our preliminary assessment, which I'll talk about more and others will talk about more, is that has created some elevated risk to people's health in the community around the facility. And we see our job as to fully understanding what the situation is, assessing all of the choices that are available for addressing the risk that exists, and then doing everything that we can under the law and under our powers of persuasion to get to a place where we've successfully addressed the issue. That's why we're here. Jim said it before, but I think it's worth repeating at the outset. I was not at the first community meeting, but I know that a commitment was made at the first community meeting that we would be back and that we would be back before the end of November, and we are. And I would like to say we're back with a full understanding of what's happening and with a solution that we have put in a box and wrapped and put on a bow on top, but we haven't. We've started a process. It's a process that will take some time, not a lot of time from my perspective, but it's important that what we do is done right, that what we do is based on the best information we can generate, that what we do is based on the best assessment of that information, and then that we make the best informed decisions that we can as to what may need to be done to find a solution. We're committed to that process. We're not at the end of that process, so we don't have answers for you tonight. We don't have all the answers. I think we may have some answers to your questions, but we're going to continue to diligently work. We're going to continue to work as quickly as we can. But as I've told many people today and over the past couple of days, we're going to go quickly, but we're not going to be in a hurry, because if we're in a hurry, we make mistakes, and that's something we don't want to do here. I wanted to spend a couple minutes and do three things. One is to look back and talk for a minute about how we got to where we are. The second thing is to look around and talk about where we think things stand, what we know, what we don't know. And the third thing I want to do is look ahead a little bit and talk about where we think this process is going. A big reason why we're here today or tonight is to hear from you, to hear your questions, to get your input, and that information, your questions, your comments, your concerns matter greatly to us, and we will certainly factor it into our thinking. So, this is a work in progress, and what I have to say is what we think right now, but it very much will be informed by what we hear from you tonight. So how did we get to where we are? Let's look back for a second. And the way I think about it is there were two important but independent things happening that eventually converged. One of them was work on new science. And I run a big part of EPA, but I don't run all of EPA, and one part of EPA that I don't run is our research office, the Office of Research and Development. And one of the important jobs of the Office of Research and Development is to do science, to learn new things. And of course, most of what they focus on are the potential adverse effects to human health or the environment from pollutants of different sizes and stripes, in our case, air pollution. So for a long time, we've known that ethylene oxide is toxic to people. That just stands to reason. That's just good common sense. What does Sterigenics use the stuff for? What do others in industry use the stuff for? They use it to sterilize stuff. So sterilants, by definition, are toxic to something. In the case of Sterigenics, possible microorganisms that might contaminate medical devices and equipment. But it's a pretty safe bet that stuff that's toxic to bugs, could be and probably is toxic to people. And we've known that since forever. And we even put a number on it. So part of what our Office of Research and Development does is create action levels for us, because when we regulate, when we have to make decisions about are we protecting public health or not, we try to be analytical. And we try to do science, we try to gather information, we try to make fact-based decisions. So the Office of Research and Development and other similar organizations come up with numbers for us, benchmarks that we use. So that if we see exposure at a given level, if it's above the benchmark, we likely have to do something. If it's below the benchmark, then maybe everything's okay. So we had a benchmark for ethylene oxide. It was out there for a long time. It said ethylene oxide is toxic. But as with most chemical substances, there was greater risk at higher levels of exposure and little, or what we might consider nominal risk, is very low levels of exposure. And so we made regulatory decisions according to that benchmark. But science is not fixed in stone. And part of what the Office of Research and Development does is follow the development of science on things that we care about, including ethylene oxide. And they began a process of reviewing that benchmark a few years ago and reached a new conclusion at the end of 2016. And their new conclusion was ethylene oxide is a lot more potent than we thought it was. To the order of 60 times more potent than we thought it was before. So that was one. I said there are two things that were moving along, and that's one thing that was moving. And that work was being done. It was important to us, but it wasn't because we were thinking about Willowbrook. It wasn't because we were thinking about other similar facilities. It was because we need that kind of information to make regulatory decisions that we make. So we weren't thinking about this. We weren't thinking about Willowbrook when that was being done. The other thing that was happening at about the same time, and took a little bit longer for us to finish, is work that my office was doing. And the work that we were doing, we call the National Air Toxics Assessment. And for those of you who have talked with us, you know we love our acronyms. We call that NATA. You might have heard of us talk about NATA, National Air Toxics Assessment is what that stands for. It's something we don't do every year. We do it typically every 3 or 4 years. It's something we don't have to do under the law. Most of what we do in my office is because Congress has told us we have to do it. You know, our primary job in my office is to implement the Federal Clean Air Act. And most of what we do is because the law says you have to go off and do that, which is fine. I mean, you know, we're a creature of statute. In the case of the NATA, the National Air Toxics Assessment, we're doing it because we want to. And we want to because it's a tool that we use to see if there are gaps in our regulatory programs that maybe we should fill using our statutory authority. So when we do a National Air Toxics Assessment, it's a two-step thing, and it is nationwide. So we look at the whole country, including Willowbrook and Chicago area and in Illinois, but everywhere else in the country as well. First thing we do is we generate what we call an emissions inventory. So we figure out who's emitting stuff we care about. And we gather that information from a lot of different sources. Some of it gets reported directly to us, some gets reported to states like Illinois, which we can get. Some gets reported to EPA through other programs like water or waste, which we can get. So we comb the country trying to find relevant information about who's emitting what and where. That's our inventory. Long list. But that's only step one. Step two, once we have that inventory, is then to do an exposure assessment. So we predict based on those emissions, what do we think ambient, what do we think exposure is like? What outside of these facilities and communities, how much stuff is out there? So we have tools we use to predict that. It's an estimate, it's not a measurement. And then once we've done that, we do a risk assessment and we say, based on these levels that we predict might exist in the community, are they higher than these benchmarks we have that I talked about before? Lower than the benchmarks we have? What does it show? Every time we do a NATA, we learn something, so it's a useful tool to us. And we find those gaps that I talked about. We find that there are some potentially elevated risks that we didn't know about, and then that gives us direction. That helps us set our priorities and figure out how we should use our resources in the Air Office. In this case, because of the new potency value for ethylene oxide, what we learned was emissions that we knew about all along. You know, what's happening here isn't because there are a bunch of new emissions out there, a bunch of new facilities, a bunch of existing facilities emitting more than they did before. Sometimes we see that, and that's a source of elevated risk. But in this case, there wasn't a big change in the emissions inventory. The change was how potent we thought ethylene oxide was. And applying that new, lower, more stringent potency value caused us to see that in many areas of the country, including Willowbrook, Illinois, we predicted there could be higher levels of risk than we previously believed existed under the prior lower potency value. So that happened earlier this year, and that's when this became a thing, because Willowbrook, what we saw, we manage risk, we regulate risk, we risk assessment and risk-based decision-making is something we do on a daily basis. So we see, estimated risks all the time, and we have to make regulatory decisions according to what the law allows us and requires us to do, against those risks. So we have kind of a seat-of-the-pants feel of kind of what typical risks are from chemicals that are emitted into the environment. What the NATA showed us this time around, though, was in certain areas of the country, including Willowbrook, Illinois, there were estimated risks that were a good bit higher than we typically see. So that's the past. Let's talk, I'm merging into the present. So we had to quickly decide what to do about this information. And the very first, we thought two things. So again, we have two tracks here, just like we had, looking back, we had two tracks that came together. looking around here and even kind of looking ahead, we're thinking about 2 tracks. One track is we're national regulators. We have authority and responsibility under the Clean Air Act to assess emissions like this. And in our world, under our law, ethylene oxide is what we call a hazardous air pollutant. That's a term of art under law, which means it's an air toxic air pollutant, okay? So there's a whole section of the Clean Air Act, very detailed, very long, that tells us what to do about toxic air pollution. And what it requires us to do initially is set technology-based emission standards. We go out and figure out how the stuff can be controlled, who's doing the best job of controlling it, and then we make everybody else. We do this industry by industry by industry. So we do petroleum refineries and chemical plants and steel plants, you name it. We got like 156, 160 of these regulations for all different parts of industry, including ethylene oxides, commercial ethylene oxide sterilizers like Sterigenics. But step one is to figure out what good controls are available and make everybody that's in this field install good controls. Then step 2 is to do a risk assessment and say, after those controls are installed and operated, is there any significant remaining risk? And if there is significant remaining risk, then we have authority and responsibility under the law to address it, make it go away. So that's how our regulatory program works. So our first reaction on getting this information from NADA was, we need to go back to those regulatory processes. And in some cases, we have already regulated. I said a second ago, we have standards in place for commercial ethylene oxide sterilizers like Sterigenics. So in that case, clearly what we need to do is go back and look at that regulation and say, is it good enough now that we know ethylene oxide is more potent than it was before? We started that process. We have, you'll meet some folks from my Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, the group that does a lot of these national standards. They happen to sit down just outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. And there's a group of people, maybe not working right now, but working on a daily basis, reassessing the standards for commercial ethylene oxide sterilizers to go through the process of deciding whether the current standards are good enough, and if not, to adjust them and make them more stringent. We have to do that through rulemaking, a very deliberate legal process. We can't just tell people, you must do this. We can't issue orders. We issue regulations. Regulations are kind of like laws. There's a process we have to go through to enact them. And we have to do it right. When we do regulations, we have to collect a bunch of data. Right? Remember, we're regulating nationwide, so we're looking at the whole country. And once we collect the data, we have to analyze it. We have to create a justification for the standards that we want to impose. We have to propose them in a very formal way. We publish that. We have to provide an opportunity for public comment, and we should provide an opportunity for public comment. We provide public hearings. We go through once all that's done, another assessment process, and we wind up finally issuing a final rule with all the supporting documentation, and that's when rules become effective, and that's when people have an obligation to meet our standards. That process takes time. Usually for a complicated rule, and these are complicated rules, we're talking about lots of months. So we're talking years, not days, not weeks, not just a few months. It takes time to do this right. But we've launched that process. But we quickly realized that, in a lot of other cases when we regulate, an industry, as I said, we know risk. That's what we do, and we know in many cases we need to regulate more and bring risk down. But the risks are not so high that we or people potentially affected have a real terrible concern in the meantime. So typically, what we see are relatively low risks that we're going to make even lower. In this case, that's not what we saw. So even though we've launched a regulatory process, and even though we will complete that regulatory process in a while, we decided that at least for a certain number of potentially higher risk facilities that we should do something sooner. So we went through a process of figuring out which of these facilities we should consider higher risk, and Willowbrook is on that list. And then we said, well, we will do a case by case by case assessment. We'll look at each of these facilities individually, and we'll go through a process not unlike rulemaking, so a process of gathering information, a process of assessing that information and doing a risk assessment on a case-specific basis, but it'll be focused on the individual facility and not focused on the country as a whole, which is what we do when we issue our national rules. That's an important process because, one, something I should have said earlier is the National Air Toxics Assessment is a very useful tool to us. It shows us gaps where our regulations are not being effective. But the National Air Toxics Assessment, for all the work we put into it and for all the information we put into it and all the time we take to do analysis, it's what we consider a screening tool. It's a rough cut. It's not precise, it's directional. So it tells us we think there may be an issue here, but where we think there may be an issue, it's a signal that we need to go take a closer look. We need to take a deeper dive. So for the country as a whole, we're going to do that through the regulatory process. But for these limited number of potentially higher risk facilities, we're going to do site-specific assessment sooner. Okay.
We'll wrap this up and then we've got a few more comments.
Okay. It's being suggested I'm taking too much time. Okay, sounds like there's support for that thought. So I'll wrap it up in a minute. Not in 30 seconds, but in a minute. All right, so we're doing a deeper dive. We're doing a deeper dive on individual facilities. Willowbrook is one of those, and you've seen some of that. I said at the beginning, we can't give you total answers because we're in the process of diving. We haven't completed our dive here. The first part of the dive is to gather information. So there has been stack testing at the facility, so we have a much better grip on what they're actually emitting, which is really, really important to us. We've done some ambient monitoring, and you saw from the notice we issued last week that we've learned a little bit about our analytical techniques, and they weren't as good as we had hoped they would be, so we'll apply that learning going forward and do additional ambient monitoring. We'll use some additional tools, we'll do the risk assessment, and then in the relative near future, and we're looking at early next year, we'll talk about timeline later on, we'll reach a point where we'll feel like we have a really good grip on what the risks look like from this facility, and that will arm us to know what we think we should do. And what we think we should do in the way of seeking, requiring, mandating additional emissions reductions, because only by getting additional emissions reductions would we be able to reduce risk in the community. So thank you for urging me along. For those who know me, I could take a lot more time to talk and look forward to talking with you as a group. But thank you again for coming. Thank you for your commitment to the issue, and I hope you can appreciate we are very committed to trying to achieve a solution to what's happening here, and look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you for your good humor in wrapping up. Joel Cresswell is here from the Congressman Lipinski's office.
Yeah, thank you so much. The congressman wishes he could be here to speak himself. He got held up on some business in DC, but he sent me out from his Washington office, and I'm going to just read a brief statement that he sent me along with. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules during the holiday season to come to this meeting. I know that this is not how anyone wants to be spending their time. If we had our way, none of us would have to worry about what it means for our health and safety to be exposed to dangerous levels of ethylene oxide. I include my family in this. I live just about 2.5 miles from Sterigenics to the northeast in the direction the exhaust generally goes. But for many reasons, here we are. It's good that the EPA is holding this meeting, as I asked them to do a while ago. And I want to thank all of the state and local officials that work diligently with the EPA to make the event happen. One thing that's been sorely lacking since we learned about the health threat emanating from the Sterigenics plant is clear public information, and I hope we're going to get a lot more of that tonight. I wanted to be at this meeting, but was detained by votes in Washington. Because Sterigenics is a little outside of my district, I know there are many of you I probably don't represent, but I want to let everyone know what I'm working on to solve this problem and to reiterate my commitment to continue to work hard until we have some certainty about the health risks from Sterigenics and have taken the right steps to protect our health. Since we first learned of the problem, I've been in close contact with multiple federal agencies. In September, I called for the US EPA to either demonstrate that Sterigenics is safe or shut it down. I called for the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry to do a new health risk assessment based on EPA's latest air testing. I called on EPA to provide expertise and assistance to any local communities that choose to do their own air testing. And I called on the EPA to immediately update their ethylene oxide regulations. Last week, I introduced a bill in Congress that will require EPA to update those regulations, including a requirement that all facilities capture pollution from their back vents, as Sterigenics recently updated its Willowbrook facility to do. This week, I joined with Senators Durbin and Duckworth and Representatives Foster and Schneider in another similar effort. EPA has been negligent in their duty to protect public health and the environment. When Congress passed the Clean Air Act, it gave EPA broad discretion and responsibility to regulate air pollutants as they saw fit. But they're not doing their job in this case, which is why I'm working hard to hold them accountable and to make things right. I know the main purpose for tonight's event is for the experts to provide us with information and for you to have the opportunity to have your questions answered. So I'll keep my remarks brief. My website, lipinski.house.gov, has a page dedicated to this issue that's a clearinghouse of information and has contact info for my staff. Please don't hesitate to contact me with questions, comments, or concerns, especially those of you who live in the 3rd District. And for constituents of mine who have already submitted questions for the EPA to my website, I want you to know that we've given those to EPA and we'll work to make sure that they get answered. This issue is my top priority and I'll do what it takes to address your needs. Thanks again.
Thank you. State Representative.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Deanne Mazzocchi. I'm here first on behalf of Jim Durkin as well as myself. So Leader Durkin, he had a death in the family, so unfortunately he could not be here this evening, but he did ask that I read the following statement to you. Since this troubling report first came out in August, I've joined my colleagues, community leaders, and thousands of residents to demand answers. We've been receiving conflicting information by the US EPA, which has complicated this matter even worse. We are employers, parents, spouses, children, workers, and longtime advocates of Willowbrook and the surrounding communities. We need accurate, clear-cut answers immediately from the US EPA about the real-world threat of ethylene oxide to our communities. We cannot proceed until we have all the accurate facts before us and can make assessments on how best to move forward in order to ensure the health and safety of our communities. On behalf of myself, Deanne Mazzocchi, in the 47th District, I want to thank every single person in this room for being here, because it's your presence here that is finally starting to drive some answers and hopefully some change. I am a scientist, I am a lawyer, and it is critically important that we focus on getting the most accurate, up-to-date, scientifically proven answers to this critical health situation that's affecting all of us. In the last 2 months, I've read more than I thought I ever would on ethylene oxide. I've delved into the scientific literature all the way back to the 1980s to the present day, both here and internationally. And as a member of the General Assembly's Environmental Committee, I have witnessed devastating health effects that have been reported by residents in this district. I have reviewed ethylene oxide test results from private businesses that they're finding inside their areas. I've received heartbreaking letters from constituents about cancer clusters. But we've had other tests and models that have been inconsistent with not only the EO model that the EPA and that OSHA have proposed, but from other models as well. And what's been frustrating for us is that when we try to get to the details, we get, I don't know. We get a bureaucratic runaround or we get a bunch of bureaucratic gobbledygook that is not practical advice that we can use to organize our lives. And that is also what has to stop. And I hope that we will finally start to get some answers here tonight. But if not, Leader Durkin and I both want you to know we are here for you. We will continue to advocate for you, as will Senator John Curran, who is also here tonight, so that you can not only get relief at the federal level, but at the state level as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have a short presentation from the community group Stop Sterigenics.
Let's see if I can multitask here. Before we start our presentation, actually, we just received a text message that Northwestern Hospital in Chicago has decided to stop use of all ethylene oxide. So with that, good evening. Those of us standing here represent the Stop Sterigenics community. We have Jeannie, Joanna, Gabriella, Ursula, Margie, Lauren, Sri, Steve, Christina, Melissa, Timothy, John, and Johanna. There's this community, and it's not just us up here, it's many of you out here as well. We want to take a moment to clarify our role in this forum. The US EPA invited us to participate to assist in asking questions that we all have. We agreed to participate because we, just like you, want answers and we want accountability. We, just like you, are sick and tired of entities and officials pointing fingers at each other. We hope to get some answers and some accountability tonight. On August 29th, many of us gathered here since the ATSDR report was released, and Mayor Trill of Willowbrook helped put together a forum to inform the communities and allow us a chance to get answers from their authors. It's been a little over 3 months, and during that time, we have come together as a community. It amazes me that I recognize so many faces in the crowd. Because of all of you, we have research permits, we have deep dived the effects of ETO, scientists, doctors, researchers, educators, moms, and dads came together to find the truth. Not the truth that Sterigenics wants us to believe, but the truth of what really has happened over the past 3 decades. Sterigenics has had numerous amounts of names over the years. These are just a few of them. Sterigenics' parent company, Sotera, is a $5 billion company. Sterigenics itself brings in $130 million a year annually. They would like you to believe that they just sterilize medical equipment. They don't. Toys for cereal boxes, Avon gift baskets, baby basins, powder deodorant, and a variety of nuts, which none of these are a medical necessity. None. They currently operate out of 2 buildings, kitty corner from each other. The buildings are owned by George Reedus, who provided Sterigenics a 99-year lease. Both buildings hold and emit ETO 24/7, 365 days a week. Even in today's statement, Sterigenics keeps trying to convince us that they follow rigorous safety protocols and outperform what the rules require. Let's take a look at their history. A 1987 toxic chemical release inventory reporting forms show that Griffith Microscience, currently Sterigenics, released 66 tons of ETO into the atmosphere that same year. A scrubber was installed in mid-1988, which had the ability to eliminate about 99% of the toxic chemical. Sound familiar? Only 0.6 pounds per day was to be emitted into the atmosphere from that point, which would equal 213.6 pounds a year. A July 1989 report by the IEPA states Griffith Microscience released approximately 48 tons of ETO into the air. Sterigenics stated that it had cut back on emissions since then. That same year, EPA environmental scientist John Summerhay stated, "In our judgment, ETO probably causes cancer in humans as well," and that ETO was cause for concern to both federal and state EPA. This was in 1989. In 1996, DuPage County ranked top 20% of all U.S. counties in the release of airborne carcinogens. Griffith was third top emitter. 22,420 pounds reported as emissions in 1996, most of which was ETO. What did Sterigenics state? They said, "We are currently installing supplemental equipment at our Willowbrook facility to further control emissions." Same story again. 10 years later, in 2006, we get the same story. Sterigenics emails U.S. EPA officials stating that they confirmed that uncontrolled emissions had been escaping from the building, but not to worry, because the back vents were connected to a control device and the emissions to the atmosphere were significantly reduced. They are not only contaminating the air we breathe with permission from the agencies here today that have given them permits to do so, but they have also been non-compliant and had leaks of various types over the years. This is a FOIA statement from the Illinois Emergency Management Agency. In October of 2013, while we were all decorating our homes for Halloween and enjoying the fall weather, Sterigenics had an uncontrolled release of 10 to 30 pounds of ETO into our atmosphere for more than 3 hours. This was due to faulty equipment that failed. The release was discovered almost 24 hours later. Please let that sink in. 24 hours later. No one else was notified. Since Sterigenics followed the Response Management Protocol, otherwise known as the RPM, that was written by Kathy Hoffman, VP of Sterigenics. Yet even then, Sterigenics VP Kathy Hoffman clearly states that there is no known or anticipated acute or chronic health risks that are associated with the release. This is a dangerous and reckless statement. For the workers exposed, for the staff at the police station across the street, for the pregnant mom shopping at Target that day, and for the children who were playing soccer at Midway Park. Take a look at these public officials today. Where were they? What did they do with this information? Illinois EPA has granted permits to Sterigenics after this date. Can you imagine? When Sterigenics uses ethylene oxide in their sterilization chambers, the byproduct is ethylene glycol. Ethylene glycol is used for other purposes, including antifreeze. Sterigenics is also making money off the back end and selling their glycol product that is sold and repurposed. In 2013, apparently their system for collecting the glycol failed and they polluted the surrounding water. The Attorney General filed a complaint against Sterigenics alleging 7 counts, including water pollution, creating a water pollution hazard, permit violations, and air pollution. In 2015, Sterigenics settled this lawsuit and a consent order was ordered by agreement, and Sterigenics paid a $50,000 fine. Again, no neighbors were notified. Sterigenics' representations about the spill also speak to the untrustworthiness and the intellectual dishonesty of the company. We received email exchange between Sterigenics VP Kathy Hoffman, Willowbrook Village Administrator Tim Halleck, and others regarding this glycol spill. Piecing together these emails, the following appears to have occurred. Tim Halleck was on the site at the spill, and Sterigenics had already hired an outside environmental waste cleanup company to start cleaning the spill. When Halleck arrived, the Sterigenics representative started backtracking, saying that they tested the glycol and they thought someone else had come by and dumped it. Halleck sarcastically commented something to the effect of, "Why is Sterigenics undertaking such a large cleanup effort if you don't believe you're at fault?" Kathy Hoffman takes this sarcastic statement and then alerts others, telling them, and I quote, "We also discussed the results with the village of Willowbrook yesterday afternoon. The village expressed verbal agreement with our conclusion that Sterigenics does not seem responsible." Halleck responds in another email to set the record straight that the Hoffman made an inaccurate statement, and he clarified that he never expressed any such agreement. This company cannot be trusted. In many ways, our community feels victimized not only by Sterigenics, but by the agencies and the officials who are supposed to protect us. Illinois EPA Director Alec Messina has indicated he is impotent to his ability to help, hamstrung by US EPA standards and regulations. Moreover, over the last few months, details have come to light that demonstrate more concern and notice to the company than to the people being harmed by it. In December of last year, 8 months prior to the release of the ATSDR report, US EPA and Illinois EPA made Sterigenics aware of this issue. Sterigenics then obtained a new construction permit from Messina's IEPA to install the new scrubbers. Some have argued that this was intentionally done to make it more difficult for legal action to be taken to halt emissions while further testing was done. Sterigenics has had advance warning, knowledge, and/or control over every aspect of testing that has ever occurred. After the ATSDR report, how does Sterigenics respond? I'm pretty sure you guys can guess it. The same way they did in 89, 96, 2006, and 2015. They said that we are working to do better, we have installed new equipment, we are reducing emissions. What makes this time different? Well, now we know, and we won't let them off the hook like these agencies and entities have for all these years. We all sat at the hearing and heard Kathy Hoffman from Sterigenics tell us they wanted to be good neighbors. They were shocked at what they were learning. More nonsense and lies. In fact, just 2 days later, Sterigenics had yet another spill of glycol on September 1st of 2018. My fingers don't want to flip the pages. The report we got through FOIA shows that on 9/1/2018, they had an ethylene glycol spill of 7 to 27 gallons with an estimated spill extent of 7,000 square feet. Was any one of us informed about this? No. What did Sterigenics say, this time to Governor Rauner on September 27th? The same lies. We quickly and voluntarily took steps to reduce emissions using pollution control equipment. We will reduce ethylene oxide emissions by over 90%. Somehow, we don't believe them. Sorry. Sterigenics has made some powerful friends in the governor's office, at the IEPA, and in the chemical lobby. Through this process, we also have learned, sadly, about the revolving door of the lobbyists and officials who are supposed to protect us. Many of you in this room have watched live feeds of legislative hearings and heard from industry lobbyists or read the letters they've written. This includes the American Chemistry Council, Mark Beal, the Ethylene Oxide Sterilization Association, which Kathy Hoffman is a member, and the Illinois Manufacturers Association, Donovan Griffith. Some of you here remember hearing testimony from Donovan Griffith, lobbying against legislation to protect us from ETO. Well, here's a picture of him and Alec getting their flu shots together. We can only hope that the elected officials who have to legislate this issue see all of this for what it really is. We sure see it, and we see you all doing it for a paycheck. Kathy Hoffman has been part of Sterigenics since 1997. She has lobbied for ethylene oxide. She travels the world promoting the products. She wrote the Risk Management Program, a program where Sterigenics tells this community on how they will operate and notify the community of any wrongdoings. Yesterday, Mark Johnson stated that according to OSHA, no violations have been reported on workers being affected by EO at Sterigenics. At the last town hall that took place here on August 29th, Kathy Hoffman was asked if she knew of any employees that were injured. Her response was, "Not that I know of. Nothing comes to mind," and I'm paraphrasing here. Well, again, that is false. We have learned of multiple workers who were injured by ETO exposures. We have heard stories of non-disclosures, of fear of speaking out. We know that there are more out there, and we're committed to finding them. The workers are the first ones that need to be notified. How many more people must suffer until the elected officials do something about it? How many more need to die to convince all of you sitting here that this is wrong? The answer should be 0, because 1 is too many. We would like to take a moment of silence, and before we do, we would like all of those that are affected, those that have personally suffered, family members that suffered from migraines, nausea, breathing problems, miscarriages, and so many other ailments. For all of those that have lost loved ones, please stand up. Thank you. We appreciate that the US EPA is here to directly communicate with our community. We hold you all accountable as well. Our request to you, update your regulations and standards to meet the science, to meet the title of your organization, Environmental Protection Agency. We are counting on you tonight and every night hereafter. When you pack up and leave, remember we are still here, breathing in this air. Some of us every single day of our lives. We are not your guinea pigs. We are not your test subjects. It is time for you to do right by this community. The next few pictures are what Sterigenics states. Safe in the future. We've seen what you've done under the leadership of Kathy Hoffman. You have monopolized our town and the US and the Illinois EPA with your own rules, regulations, and testing. You need to be removed from this process. Safe yesterday. 66 tons, 48 tons is not acceptable. We need to ensure that the guidelines stay up to date. Safe today. Standards for emissions don't include public notification requirements when something goes wrong. Standards for emissions don't capture all sources of emissions. Because of Illinois EPA and US EPA have not updated the risk assessments, in 2008 they chose not to update scrubbing efficiency requirements to the latest 99.9% technology, have not followed up with the companies on commitments to reduce emissions. Sterigenics gets to proclaim that they are compliant and safe. We want to ban ETO. And we are all here, everybody in this room, to tell Sterigenics that we will not stop until you are gone and leave our community.
Thank you, Narinja, and thank you everyone who was up here. And first up, Sterigenics for helping with this process tonight. This is probably a terrible juxtaposition, but Sterigenics has offered up a statement for tonight's meeting. Nobody's going to read it. We have printed out copies, and it is available, it will be available on the table as you leave tonight. So if you want a copy of their statement, by all means, pick one up on the way out. Now I'd like to introduce Mike Kerber, the Deputy Office Director for EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. And Mike's going to kind of give us a little bit of an overview, set the stage for where we are in this process.
Thank you, Doug. Is that on? Yeah, thank you. Thank you all very much. Great turnout tonight. You've been very patient. Indulge me for 5 more minutes, and then we will turn to you and your questions. And we'll have 3 panels come up here and hopefully give you answers. Thanks. So I just want to take a few minutes to talk about what we've been doing, what we will be doing to help address and deal with ethylene oxide in your community. We've learned a lot over the last couple of months, but there is still more that we do not yet know. We've been focusing on trying to understand what's being emitted from the facility and what's in the air that you breathe. So I'm going to talk about two things very briefly: emissions from the facility and some recent air monitoring that we've begun in the community. So as you're all aware, actions were taken back in late July to reduce emissions. And here you can see the before on the left and the after result of that. There were stack measurements taken, emission measurements taken in late September, and we received the test reports in mid-October. We were actually on site along with Illinois EPA to make sure that the testing was done correctly, and we believe it was. And the report shows that emissions from the facilities was reduced on the order of about 90%. Is that enough? No. We don't know. No. We don't know. We still aren't sure about what the current risk levels are in the community. So why don't we know if this is enough? Well, it's the yellow portion of these bars, the fugitive emissions, the leaks, the emissions that are escaping from vents and doors at the facility. We don't know really what those emissions are, and we need to understand the total emissions from the facility so we can accurately characterize the risk in the community. The yellow estimates here, those amounts, those are numbers estimated provided by the company. We don't know if those numbers are right. So we are doing air monitoring. We are gathering additional information to see if those numbers need to be adjusted. Once we have that information, then we can do an accurate risk assessment. I know everyone wants answers now, but it's important to gather the necessary information, do the science right, to make sure that we have sufficient information to make informed decisions. The other thing I want to talk about is the recent air monitoring that we've begun at 8 locations around the communities. This started a couple weeks ago. We do not have data back yet, but as soon as we have data, it will be posted on our website and we will make that publicly available. And we want to continue to engage with you. In mid-December, we'll hold a webinar where we'll explain the data that we've collected. We don't want to just throw it up on our website and not tell you what it means. We want to actually walk people through it and take questions about that information that we've collected. So periodically, we will be in touch with you to talk about what all that information means. Monitoring for ethylene oxide is very challenging. We've said for some time that the current methods are not very sensitive, that we can't measure down at very low levels that we expect to see throughout the community. Also, we've learned recently, because we don't have a lot of experience measuring for this particular chemical, that there's a potential interference issue. That was the statement we posted on our website last week. I don't know if that means previous measurements are invalid. We just don't know if that interference issue was a problem or not. Going forward with these measurements, we will quantify ethylene oxide. We will quantify this other chemical that we think is possibly causing the interference, so we'll be able to tease that out. So we'll have more accurate information going forward. The reason we shared that information was not to discredit past work that was done, but to be transparent about the science that we are currently doing and to share the latest information with all of you. You might be wondering if that statement means that we are no longer concerned about ethylene oxide in this community, and that was not our intent at all. We are still very much concerned. We are here tonight. You have our top air official from EPA's attention, and he is here tonight. We are still very much concerned and want to get to a reasonable solution here. We'll be back to meet with all of you as soon as we have more information. As I said, we're going to be providing periodic updates. We'll have conference calls with community leaders and others. We'll be providing webinars as necessary. And when we complete our risk assessment in a couple of months, we'll be back and share those results with you. That is the key piece of information that we need to make our regulatory decisions and determine how much more emissions need to be reduced from this facility. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll turn it back to Doug, and we can finally turn to your questions.
Thank you, Mike. You can hang on to that one. So as we said, we're really having our main event here is these 3 panels. We're going to start panel 1 here in a second. Mike's going to be joined on the stage with Kelly Reimer. So you guys can go ahead and take a seat. But we also have, in addition to the panelists that are going to be up on the stage, we have a number of experts here in the audience who we can call on, and the panelists can call on to answer questions. And so I want to just let them introduce themselves. Folks who are kind of extra experts here to help, if you'd stand up, and I'm going to let you pass around the microphone and just introduce yourself and where you're from.
Good evening. I'm Michelle College with ATSDR here in Region 5. ATSDR is a branch of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Mark Johnson, I'm the Regional Director for ATSDR, Region 5.
Hi, I'm Susan Buchanan. I'm a physician at UIC in environmental health among children and adults.
I'm Clint Woods. I'm the Deputy Assistant Administrator in EPA's Office of Air and Radiation in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Laura McKelvey. I'm in the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, and I am the person who will be leading the ongoing engagement with you guys as for webinars and setting up the opportunities for reporting out with you guys.
Hello, my name is Ned Shapley with the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards.
We have any others that I missed? Yep.
Hello, my name is Ed Naum. I'm the Director of the Air and Radiation Division here in EPA Region 5.
Alexis Kane in the Air Toxics Program in Region 5.
Hi, I'm Katie Siegel. I'm also with the Air Toxics Program here in Region 5.
So I'm going to ask Mike and Kelly to come on up and have a seat. And our two questioners today are Mayor Tom Hinshaw and Ursula Tanue from Stop Sterigenics. They've been working with the questions. These questions were put together in a very rapid fashion over the last 2 weeks as they were coming in, trying to get them organized, trying to get them in a fashion that allows us to have a good conversation. And we really appreciate the effort of the questioners themselves to go through the questions and help organize them into a fashion that will allow them to ask. So we're going to leave it up to them. They have the ability to select how they want to propose those questions. Our panelists will answer to the best of their ability, pull in other experts as they need. So I'll turn to the questioners.
Hi. I think I need to ask a first question that was not included. As was stated earlier today, the risks appear to be high and measurement methods are limited. Why has Sterigenics been allowed to stay open while further assessments are made?
So I might ask Bill if he'd like to help me on this one as well, being our top air official. But we do have authority under the Clean Air Act to address under emergency situations the operation of various facilities. We have very limited ability to take temporary action. Our commitment is to try to find a long-term solution that is sustainable for this community.
Right. Okay. I'll elaborate a little bit. We regulate, you heard me say it, I went on too long obviously, but we regulate a lot of different chemicals from a lot of different plants in a lot of different places, and we see elevated risk a lot. And the answer for us cannot be every time we see elevated risk, we demand facility shutdown until it can be resolved. Right. Because we operate the opposite way, which is
Folks, if we could let the answers get out, we'll get out of here faster.
right. But I thank you for your input, and I truly mean that. I mean, that's why we're here. That's why this is a community meeting, because we know you care, and I hope I hope by the end you'll realize that we care too. But, you know. Yes, the comment was actions speak louder than words for those who didn't hear it. Right. But you've heard me say it and Mike say it already, and you'll hear it plenty of times tonight. You know, we try to be deliberate, we try to be deliberative, and we try to gather fact and we try to act on fact. And the very first thing we need to do is understand as completely as we can what the emissions are, and that arms us with the information we need to know what needs to be done. And if we act before we have fact, we're not doing anybody a service. We're not doing you a service, because the next time maybe that decision goes against you. So we have to have a logical process, we have to have a fact-driven process, ultimately we have to have a legal process, and what that means to us is we act deliberately, we act quickly, and we assess problems and we try to solve problems. That's exactly what we're doing here.
Thank you.
Do it slow.
How long does ethylene oxide stay in the air, and how does it degrade?
Ethylene oxide can stay in the air for up to about a couple of months.
What?
In terms of degradation, often it's fairly stable, and actually it will move with the air, and that's really how it will leave the area.
Where? So just to clarify, the amount of ethylene oxide released from sterilization facilities like Sterigenics accumulates because more is added to the air every day, and it takes a long time to degrade.
Correct.
Thank you.
But let me just add, it disperses in the atmosphere. So the air moves, whatever is emitted, released, it moves with the air downwind. It moves away from the facility.
Does exercising outside near Sterigenics pose a greater risk than those who don't?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I couldn't hear the question.
Sure. Does outdoor exercise expose you to greater risk than those who don't exercise outdoors?
So when somebody exercises outdoors, they breathe more, and so there is more exposure. We are very concerned about long-term effects. So over a lifetime, periodic exercising may or may not increase your exposure, but when you exercise, you do breathe more. And I don't know if ATSGR or Dr. Buchanan wants to add anything to that.
All right, thank you. Does ETO accumulate in drywall, carpet, and other fibrous materials?
There's not a lot of information on that. There's not been a lot of testing. Ethylene oxide for us as being a chemical that we need to learn about is relatively new. The increased potency that was discovered a couple years ago has made us focus much more on ethylene oxide than we had before. Before it was one of the many pollutants in the urban soup. Now it's something that we really need to focus on. So there's not a lot of information. What our indoor office folks have told us is that they don't expect it to accumulate, but there's just not a lot of data to understand that. And that's what more work needs to be done on that to really understand it.
So outside of actual items that it could accumulate on, has there been testing of just indoor air levels of ethylene oxide? And what were those results?
US EPA has not done any indoor air testing. What we do when we do our assessments, we usually do assessments that use very, very powerful models, because those models can get us an understanding of what's in the air at very low levels. When we use those models, we make the assumption that the outside air is the same concentration as the inside air. We make an assessment, so we don't want to underestimate the risks. So while we don't test inside to determine is there a difference between indoor air and outdoor air, we make the assumption when we are doing our assessments and going to make a decision on whether or not to and how far to reduce those emissions, we assume that you're breathing the same amount when you're indoors as when you're outdoors. That will help us avoid underestimating the risks.
And what happens if you are underestimating those risks and it does accumulate indoors?
Our risk assessments are reasonably conservative, but there is a possibility that if ethylene oxide does accumulate, there would be an underestimate. Again, our indoor air folks say that that's not expected, but more work needs to be done.
Thank you. Why is ethylene oxide used to sterilize spices, agricultural products, cosmetics, toys, and other things?
Ethylene oxide is a very powerful fumigant. It kills microbes, it kills germs. It's extremely, and that's, yes, it is. Ethylene oxide is a very powerful, and it harms things we want harmed. We want to get rid of we want our Band-Aids. When I put my Band-Aid on, I want to make sure that Band-Aid is sterilized. But with that means it also can harm people. And that's why we are here to get more information about what's being emitted from the facility and do an assessment to better understand what the risks for all you guys are.
What alternatives to ETO are there, and what are federal agencies doing to encourage or require shifting as much of the necessary sterilization need to those alternatives?
Yeah, that's not a question that is within my expertise. I don't know if we have somebody that can answer that question.
And if we don't, I'm not sure we have an answer tonight. We will definitely provide an answer for you on that one.
How long has it been known that ethylene oxide is carcinogenic at much lower levels than previously understood?
So the EPA periodically evaluates chemicals to determine how toxic they are. The final assessment of the last time EPA did that was in December of 2016. Before that, we had a very strong suspicion. We call it a probable human carcinogen. So we've known ethylene oxide is bad stuff for a long time. The new data that came in the early 2000s was human data. And that information was used to develop the new toxicity value. And that's when the realization that ethylene oxide was much more toxic than previously understood was determined, and that information was final in December of 2016.
You've already done 2 studies. Why are you doing another one?
So I believe the 2 studies that you're referring to is the National Air Toxics Assessment, NATA, that Bill walked through, which sought to answer the question, are there places in the country where we need to look further and do more detailed analysis to understand what the real risks are? So that was the first analysis. We call it a screening analysis. It doesn't say what anybody's risk is. It says we need to do more work to understand whether or not there's a risk that needs to be dealt with. I believe the second study you're talking to is the ATSDR study that Michelle and Mark did. And that took a little bit closer look at just the emissions from Sterigenics and asked a similar question. If those emissions lasted for a long period of time at the level that we had from those snapshots, is there a public health issue? And that answer was also yes. The next steps is to do a very detailed analysis that will help us understand much better what levels of ethylene oxide in the air are you all breathing, and then we couple that with the information about how toxic it is, and we'll have a better understanding of what the risks are.
Thank you. It looks like the amount of ETO used as Sterigenics was higher in prior years. Does that mean that the risk was higher in those prior years?
We agree that know that the emissions were higher in previous years, therefore what you all were breathing in previous years was higher. And that, yes, that does mean that the risks, your risks in the past were higher than they actually are now.
So with those higher risks, what were the long-term effects of those risks as opposed to the risks that are being accumulated now?
Can you repeat? I'm not sure I understand the question.
So the volumes that were being emitted were higher before.
Correct.
What kind of risks were present then and what kind are now?
Okay. So we know that the risks were higher, but we don't have information from the past to put a number to that risk. So we now, so we can't say what the risk was. We can't give you a number for what the risk was in the past. Going forward, we are getting the information, very good information on what's being emitted from Sterigenics, and we'll be able to, going forward, give you a number, a current number of what the risk is. But unfortunately, we can't put a number to the past risks, other than to say that we do know that they were higher.
Sterigenics said that ATSDR used a risk criterion that is much lower than the laboratories generally can measure. Does that mean ATSDR made a mistake?
ATSDR did not make a mistake. ATSDR did a study that said, based on some preliminary modeling information about from the preliminary information about what Sterigenics was emitting, and they used a model to estimate what the concentrations were around the country, or around the county. They asked the question, if these levels stay, if these levels last for years, might there be a public health issue? And that answer was yes.
In a press release from the Illinois EPA, and also as was mentioned earlier, the EPA stated that the ETO concentration, or the ETO risk is 60 times more than once believed. Will the new assessment reflect this increase in potency, and can you describe what a detailed or refined risk assessment means?
Sure. The assessment that we're going to do going forward will use the new value of toxicity. So we'll use that value that's 60 times more potent than the previous one. Generally, how we do the work, this is how we do the work here, and this is how we do the work all across the country when we do these risk assessments, is we get the best information we can about what's coming out of the facility. We have a pretty good handle on what's coming out of the stacks, the part of the pollution that's being put through the control device. We have a pretty good understanding of what is coming in the air from those stacks. There's other emissions that are coming out, maybe events or leaks, and those escape from the plant, and so we call those fugitive emissions. And that's what, when Mike was showing the slide, remember the slide that had the yellow part, and that's the part that we are getting information on to understand the fugitive emissions. So once we have a handle on all of the emissions that are coming out of the facility, we put those emissions into a very powerful model that will sort of disperse the emissions up and provide an understanding of what the concentrations are, what you all are breathing. And then again, we couple that information with what we know about the toxicity, and we'll have the risk. It's going to take a little bit of time to understand those fugitive emissions. We've got to get it right. We have to follow the science and do it right. So it'll be a couple of months before we have all the information we need to conduct the assessment. Once we have all the information we need, it doesn't take that long to conduct the assessment. And as soon as we're done with that assessment, we'll let you all know what the results are, and we're going to come back to you guys and talk about it.
Okay, I've got a kind of a multi-part question. How much background ethylene oxide is in the air? And is it enough to cause cancer? And then can you kind of explain what the background means?
Yeah, let me take that one. We don't know. As I said before, we don't have a lot of experience measuring this particular chemical. We don't have many years or very many measurements at all of ethylene oxide in Willowbrook or any place else around the country. So in terms of what the measured background levels are, we don't know. but we will know as a result of the monitoring study that we are currently conducting in your community. And we have other air toxic sites around the country. We can look and gather that same kind of information so we can begin to characterize what the baseline, what the background is that companies emit into the air above and beyond that background. So we don't know, but we're working to find that out.
And what sources of emissions create that background noise?
We don't know that yet either. That's something we need to look at our emissions inventories and see what potential sources might be there for ethylene oxide. But I think we need to look to some of our measurements first to actually see what the levels are away from high emitting facilities.
What is an acceptable or a safe level of ethylene oxide?
So,
Zero.
so for a chemical like ethylene oxide, which is one of these air toxics that we are directed to regulate by the Clean Air Act, the EPA doesn't have a level or a bright line or a number that we put out about a level at which below is okay and above is not okay. It's a little more complicated than that. We need to do a risk assessment to determine what the risk is. Again, just like I explained, we need to understand what y'all are breathing, how toxic it is. We put that together, we have a risk assessment. And then we look at that risk assessment and we look at the results of the risks. And then we also have to look at actually the study that we did. We have to look at how certain are we about those emissions that are coming out of the stack. Even with the stack test, there's going to be some uncertainty, some unknown, so we need to take that into consideration. We also have to look at how certain we are about that toxicity value. When EPA develops a toxicity value, we usually develop a toxicity value that makes it so that when we do the risk assessment, we're overestimating the risk, not underestimating the risk. We don't want to underestimate the risk. We take all of that information together, and then we determine what is safe, or we determine if the emissions need to be low or if the emissions are low enough. It's a process that we do with scientists and engineers and people from all over the EPA offices, and we bring all that information together, and then the decision is made about whether or not the emissions need to be lowered or if they're low enough.
So what's the deadline?
Let me just add to what Kelly said. Under the law, and our job at EPA is to follow the law, we do set safe levels for some air pollutants. Ozone, smog, that's a problem here in the summertime, right? I know, I lived here for all my life, up until a few years ago. We do set safe levels for ozone and particles. So we do have that authority, and we do that under the Clean Air Act. The air toxics part of the Clean Air Act works differently. We regulate based on risk. We do not set safe levels. We regulate based on risk, as Kelly described. So the way the law works, and we follow the law, is a little bit different for air toxics than it is for other pollutants.
So at what level of risk would you draw the line in the sand? Or does this become a negotiation between the industry and the EPA once you have the data?
So it's not a negotiation. It's a process that is based in science and is directed by the Clean Air Act. And it's a decision that the EPA makes, again, in concert with our scientists, our engineers. We have a policy group that weighs in to make sure we are evaluating the risk correctly according to how the Clean Air Act tells us how to do it. We then, when we set a regulation, we then propose the regulation out to the public, and everybody gets to weigh in on whether or not they agree with that level, whether or not they agree with the decision. So it's a process that starts with the science, part that's informed by what the law tells us to do, And then is part of it where we put that out to the public, and the public can weigh in and determine and weigh in, and then we take those public comments very seriously and we make the final decision. That is a very good question. When we do a rule, we have a public comment period time, and I bet you Laura will talk about this in the third panel about how to stay involved. But we put the decision out for public comment, and people can write in as long as they want. We get a lot of very lengthy comments, and then we take all those comments and we evaluate them and we respond to those comments in our final decision. We also often have a public hearing where people can come and hear about the rule and speak and weigh in that way too.
I want to remind everybody that the questions that Ursula and I are reading have been submitted to the EPA, so we were volunteered to read the questions. Has there been a study of cancer rates in our area?
From what we understand, that the state of Illinois' public health department is pursuing a study right now on that. I don't have the information about when that might be done. We will get that information to you. We'll work with the Department of Public Health to get that information out with an expectation of when you guys will have that information.
Is it fair to assume that the incidence of cancer in Willowbrook is substantially and naturally higher than that of the rest of the state of Illinois?
I think the answer to that right now is we don't know, and after the Department of Public Health finishes their study, I believe that there will be a better understanding of that. That's the hope anyway.
Can ethylene oxide get into the water supply?
Yeah. So, yeah, I think Bill can answer that one.
Well, I'll answer just because we got that question from someone in the Illinois congressional delegation, so I ended up having to send a letter back in response. So what we did is consulted, we're all air experts, we're not water people, so we consulted with our Office of Water to ask them if they thought there was any reasonable possibility that ethylene oxide emitted into the air would somehow make it into the water. And their judgment, which we sent back in the letter, was they don't see any way that that reasonably could occur in any significant quantity. So they the initial assessment of our water office is they don't think air emissions ultimately should result in contamination of water. I'm sorry, I didn't hear what was the question? Glycol. Yeah, okay, glycol. So what I don't know, so this is, in the category of things we don't know completely. I don't know how much ethylene oxide, if any, is in that glycol. And so the answer might be, if there's no ethylene oxide in the glycol, zero. I suspect there may be a little bit of ethylene oxide in that glycol because it comes from their pollution control device. They use glycol, or it's produced in their pollution control devices. So if there is there's some possibility of glycol spilled that ethylene would make it into the soil or into the water. But I'm just talking about theoretical possibilities. We don't have hard information on that question right now.
I think what the questioner meant was, is there ethylene glycol in the water supply?
And that's not, we don't have that answer tonight, and we'll work to get that answer to you.
So we only have about 5 more minutes left in this panel.
Is the amount of ethylene oxide emitted into the air enough to cause concern for children and their ability to learn and function normally?
I don't know if Dr. Buchanan wants to start that answer.
Can you repeat the beginning of the question, please?
Is the amount of ethylene oxide emitted into the air enough to cause concern for children?
I hate to join the cadre of people saying we don't know, but I have looked at the literature on ethylene oxide exposures in children, and there isn't anything. So this is an area that has not been studied before. So I am unable to say whether that there are definitive studies. Neurodevelopmental problems have not been seen at the low doses seen in the area from the admissions from Sterigenics. So that we know of, the levels that are out there now and have been out there for the last few years are not related to neurodevelopmental outcomes. Yeah, I just don't have, there just isn't any literature on that. It's impossible to say.
Too bad.
If you'll stay a little bit, Dr. Buchanan. What is the comparative susceptibility of children to toxins like ethylene oxide compared to adults? And how does that prescribe how you treat this contamination?
So children in general are at higher risk because of exposure, from exposure to environmental toxicants, because they breathe more rapidly than we do, and they breathe more air per body weight. So in general, if there's something in the air, children are going to get more of it compared to adults. They also live longer, so children obviously have longer lifespans. So for carcinogens, if there are cancers that are going to develop that have a latency or a delay of 20, 30, or 40 years from exposure to development of the cancer, the child has a longer time to develop that. So people who are obviously in their 50s or 60s and are exposed to a carcinogen that takes 30 years to develop, some of those people aren't going to be around long enough to have the cancer develop. But children have a full lifetime ahead of them, so we consider them to be at especially high risk from carcinogens.
I think this will be the last question from this panel. Okay, I will make this one exception, ma'am, but we do need to move along.
I really appreciate it.
I was a senior manager for the federal government for 37 years. And talk about roadblocks and crap that you had to put up with in trying to make an impression was so difficult. And I can only imagine under the new administration it's even worse. I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2015. Ironically, I was transferred to this area in 1989, which is one of our little milestones. What I'm saying to you is right now, we've got to go somewhere. When I needed to have something done critically, I had to find the person that I could talk to, not just go back to the stats. 30 years is a long time. Look how many people. You saw the people that stood up when they'd lost loved ones. I have a whole community of friends that have cancer, and we need accountability. We need to know, I need to look at you, I need to look in your eyes, that you'll go back and you'll make not just a report, but make a difference. Go to the person that can get through all this crap. I'm really, really asking you this so sincerely. And God bless every one of you. Good luck.
Thank you, ma'am. Last question? No, we're good. Okay. Can I get Larry and Steve to come on up from the fire department? We're going to have a quick presentation from the fire department. I'm going to ask you to try to be as expeditious as you can, and then we'll launch into panel 2.
So my name is Larry Link. I am the Fire Prevention Director for the Tri-State Fire Protection District. And on behalf of Chief Molinaro and our chief officers that are here tonight, I'd like to thank you for inviting us to this discussion. We have a 30-minute presentation. We have 10 minutes, so we're going to whip through it, okay? So we cover Darien, Burr Ridge, Willowbrook, Willow Springs, and unincorporated DuPage County. We have 17 firefighters on duty plus staff. every day. We are a insurance service ISO 2 rated fire department. I know that doesn't mean a lot to you, but it means that we're in the top 3% of fire departments nationwide. The core functions, that's not why I said that. What happened here? The core function of the fire departments, there's 3 basic functions. We are here to prevent bad things from happening. We're here to take care of problems if people have medical issues, and if there's a fire or any other kind of mishap, we're here to handle that problem as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Fire Prevention Bureau, just so you know what we do and how we work with your community and with organizations like Sterigenics. We have 8 fire prevention personnel, 7 inspectors that are out on a daily basis inspecting at least once a year every building in the district that does business or where people live. On top of that, we are in these buildings for re-inspections, and we also we require that each business has their sprinkler system tested by an outside agency twice a year, and we require their fire alarms to be tested twice a year as well. So that's people in our business are in these buildings pretty often. Here's some ways that we try to prevent problems. So when a building's being built, we review all the plans, we review the way the building's built, we review the exiting, we review the fire alarm systems, the sprinkler systems, and we make sure that they are up to current code. We inspect new structures prior to their opening. So Pete's Market opened recently. We're in there making sure that everything's safe before the public's allowed to go in there. New spaces, when they're remodeled, we make sure that everything's been done properly. Changes in occupancy. So if a building one day is an office building and the next day they're sterilizing equipment, we review those plans and make sure that whatever equipment is in there that's necessary to keep them compliant with the code is in there. We check the fire alarm systems, the sprinkler systems. We do our annual inspections and re-inspections. So this year, up to September, we did 2,510 inspections, 241 service provider inspections. That's the people that go in from a separate company and check systems out. And then they report back to us and let us know that everything's okay. We've done 115 plan reviews, and we've done 319 investigations, training, and pub ed events. One of the things that is difficult for us is that there's a bunch of regulatory agencies, and you can see them on here, and this isn't everybody. I mean, there's more people here tonight than this, but these are some of the regulatory agencies in the area. Here's what we can't regulate, and there's a lot more things, but we have nothing to say about a village's, whether it's Willowbrook or Darien or Burridge, we have nothing to say about their zoning laws. So if they say something can go, in this property, they can do it. We have nothing to say about emissions, and we can't determine what types of materials can be stored on site or not. Here's what we can do. We can make sure that the storage of the materials, let's say ethylene oxide, we can make sure that they do not store more than the law allows them to store in their facility. We can make sure their sprinkler systems are working. We can make sure that they have the proper sprinkler system that's designed for that material. We check their fire alarms, make sure that they work properly. And we make sure that they follow all the laws that we have adopted in the International Fire Code and the NFPA as adopted by the state of Illinois. We have 4 stations. I'm not going to read you everything that's in these stations, but we have a station in Willowbrook, a station in Darien, a station in Burridge, and a station in Willow Springs. And so from our initial response can come any of this equipment here. This is Station 2 in Darien. Station 3 in Burridge, Station 4 in Willow Springs. Steve, you're up.
Hi, my name is Lieutenant Steve Vogel. I'm with the Tri-State Fire Protection District. I am the hazmat coordinator for our department. And as you saw all the equipment up there, we have all that equipment we can use. However, what we don't have is our own hazmat team. There's no suburban department that can afford to have their own hazmat team. The equipment's too expensive, the training's too extensive. So what we do is we actually join together with an organization called MAVIS, which is Mutual Aid Box Alarm System. So what happens is that system, the whole state is broken into different divisions. So our division is Division 10. It's about approximately 12 fire departments that join together, share resources, money, and training. So what our Division 10 hazmat team does is we have a specialized, what we call a squad at Pleasantview Fire Department, which is right next door to us. We do annual and monthly training. We do recertification through the state. We're all certified up to technician level 2. It's a lot of extra training. It's a lot of extra time. It's all voluntary. So I just want to let you know that I keep getting questions. Are we ready if anything goes wrong with this? I mean, we don't deal with the long-term cancer aspects. We deal with, will this chemical catch fire? Can it explode? Can it leak? Can it kill people directly? Yes, all that stuff, we've all been through that. We all know that. We are trained to deal with that, and we have specialized equipment to deal with that. So the first thing we would do on the scene is we would look this chemical up in what's called the ERG. That's kind of like the Bible of hazmat for the first in responders. Most of the really bad chemicals that are out there, they'll show you something like this and it'll give you some basic response guides. So what we've done is we've taken this and other sources out there and created an actual incident action plan for any of these possible incidents that could go wrong at the plant. So we actually have more in-depth plans than any of this stuff. So what this would show you here is what your initial evacuation plans, protect in place plans are. So we've already gone through all this stuff. So now, normally on a hazmat, when you pull up, you don't know what you've got. You've got to figure out what you've got. You don't know where you're at. This, we know where we're going. We know what we have. We know how much is there, and we've already done all the science. So we're already way ahead of the game. In the future, I wouldn't be surprised if the entire team starts training specifically on this chemical, since this has been such a big issue. But I just want to let everybody know that yes, we are prepared, even though we're a small department. This is just some examples too on the isolation distance. I mean, I've seen this on Facebook and various things that have popped up. This is basically the programs used that tell us we put the chemical in, we put, if it's a large spill, a small spill, we put the weather, we put wind direction, and this gives us some basic guidelines on what to do initially. These are other examples that we printed up. So just really quickly, I already went through MAVIS. Chicago Fire Department is part of MAVIS, Milwaukee Fire Department. So all this stuff is there for us. MAVIS is not the only resource we have. We can also get state and county and federal resources if we need them through the Emergency Response Center. So if we call for what's called a task force, we could even call for something that would look like this if things get bad enough. This is normally stuff that you would see at tornadoes, earthquakes, that kind of thing, but we can also mobilize this kind of equipment for a hazardous material incident if it was ever bad enough. So this is just some more how the state is broken down with MAVIS. This is just some example equipment that if we ever would need it for whatever reason from MAVIS that we can mobilize right through our dispatch center. So there's decontamination vehicles. There's entire vehicles that do nothing but bring us air bottles. There's some incident supply equipment. There's an entire tent city. We can actually mobilize and put an entire, one of that giant task force, we can actually house and feed all those personnel if we needed to, for whatever reason. So just for these are some specialized meters that might come into play, especially the area array. What those are is that would be able to detect the ethylene oxide, and they would be unmanned meters that we could put at different spots. And in our command center, we could actually get real-time readings on those meters. And this is a typical chemical suit like we would be wearing in an event like that. Again, much too expensive for any one department, but we do have access to all of it.
Can I ask you a real quick question? If you guys do that much to prepare for this chemical, why the hell is this chemical?
No, sir. We prepare for every chemical. This is just one of a list. This is stuff we have access to every day. This has nothing directly to do with this particular chemical or even Willowbrook. This is something that we do statewide, so we're ready for anything.
So one of the things is we did want to alleviate some of the concern whether or not we're doing anything to prevent a problem at this facility or any of the other facilities within the district, and whether or not we're prepared to handle an incident that might happen here or anywhere else. And we're just kind of trying to help you out and make you feel maybe a little bit at ease that we are here and we will do our job and we're prepared to do it. But the last thing I want to do, and get your pencils ready, because at the end of this, I'm going to give you my phone number. So here's what you can do. You can, if you want to be notified if there's an incident at Sterigenics or any other place, any place you might want to be afraid of, you can go to Tri-State Fire Department's Twitter account, which is Tri-State FD. You can see it there. You can also see all of this on our website. So if you go to our website, there's a Notify Me button. You push that, you get to this page. You can also sign up in Willowbrook. You can sign up on the Nixle website, and we have a link to all of these sites on our website. Burr Ridge is also Nixle. Darien is there on Twitter. Willow Springs is reverse 911, and DuPage County is on alert. Again, go to our website, tristatefd.com, and you can click on any one of these links, and you'll get to the place where you need to sign up to be notified in your community. Now, what we'll do is, if there's an incident, we will put out in real time messages on Twitter that will tell you, shelter in place, evacuate, stay away from this road, whatever and it won't just be Sterigenics, it'll be any incident. And that's one of the things we learned from this. So you will have real-time information. And if you have trouble with Twitter, just ask your kids, because that's what I did.
Yeah, so we do need to wrap this up, but go ahead. Quick question.
I'm sorry, that's not my decision, but I'll let the chief address that.
The question was about the glycol spill.
The question is there was recently a glycol spill, and would we have notified the public about that spill?
I would just say this, and pardon me for, I guess my portion of the presentation got cut. So I'm the new guy. I've been at Tri-State for 10 months. Welcome to Tri-State. But, you know, the question was, would we have notified people about this spill that happened on September 1st? And the quick answer to that is, unfortunately, we just got this up and running in the last, I would say, 2 weeks. So our intention is to notify the public in this manner. The old manner in which we used to do notifications was calling that MAPIS alarm box, getting multiple agencies coming, and going door to door. That's how we notified people to evacuate. That's how we notified the shelter in place. Now, I'm like Larry. My daughter would have to show me how to do Twitter and Facebook, but this is the wave of the future. This is what we've been told, that this is the modern way to notify people. Now, that being said, the people that aren't on Facebook, ain't on Twitter, we are going to still eventually get out there and have to do it the old-fashioned way.
Chief,
That's just
I'm
the
sorry,
fact of the
we
matter.
really do have to move along.
Okay, so
I got cut off.
lastly, my name is Larry Link. I work in fire prevention, and you can call my office any day, 630-654-6284, and I will address any question you have. Not sure if I always know the answer, but I will try.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it. Sorry for pushing you along, but we need to get up to panel 2. If we could get Alec up and Mike's back up, and Bill's back up. And our questioners for this this panel are Shri Rao and John Waywak. And they're ready to go. They have their mics, and there's mics up there. So take it away.
All right, the first question for this group is, how does the sterilization process work?
That really is behind our scope in the fire service.
I would hope somebody from EPA could actually describe what they're doing in the building.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I went to the facility today. I've never seen it before, so I felt it was important to know what it was we were talking about, so I spent an hour over there this afternoon. I can tell you what I saw. I'm no sterilization expert, but it's basically a three-part process that they have. The material, interestingly, comes in on pallets in cardboard boxes. What they showed me was medical devices, like a tracheotomy kit that you might use in emergency response to provide an airway. That kind of thing, like a long catheter. They had boxes full, but it basically cardboard boxes full of medical devices is what I saw on wooden pallets that you would like put them on, load them up and put them on a truck, wrapped in clear plastic wrap. They don't even unpack all that, so they take that, they put it in a preconditioning room to heat it up and raise the humidity. So that's important for the sterilization to be as effective as it can be. That's what they explain. So I'm reporting to you. I'm not purporting to be an expert. Once they've pre-conditioned just with heat and humidity, like 100 degrees, very humid, they take the pallets, they put whole pallets into the sterilization chamber. The sterilization chamber is a big metal box that can hold several pallets at a time. Close the door, they pull a vacuum on it, so pull out all the air, and then they sweep it with nitrogen a couple times to inert, because ethylene oxide is very flammable and they don't want to create a flammable condition in the sterilizer, so they sweep it with nitrogen, and then at that point they add the ethylene oxide, and then they let it sit in that box for a period of time for the sterilization to occur. Once they wait that period of time, they pull the ethylene oxide out of the box, and then they sweep it with nitrogen several more times to get as much of the ethylene oxide off what they're sterilizing before they reopen this chamber. Then they open up the chamber. When all that's done, transfer the treated material into what they call an aeration room, and there they let it sit, and that room has emissions controls on it, and they let it sit because after it's been fumigated, there's still some ethylene oxide inside the material and inside the box. They let it sit for a period of time so that can come off before they actually put it back on the trucks and ship it. And so when it's aerating, as they call it, they collect those emissions and put them through one of their emissions control devices. So that, roughly speaking, is how they do what they do. If you need any more technical explanation, we would have to get back to you on that. We'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. Are all discharges of ETO connected to scrubbers at the Sterigenics facility? These would include the main vent, when ETO is pumped out of the sterilization chamber at the end of a cycle, any back vents during the purging of the chamber, and vents. And was it that way in the past?
Okay, well, I'll take that one again since I saw it today. So there's no ethylene oxide until you get to the fumigation part, so that the pre-treatment thing that I described is just heat and humidity. They add ethylene oxide in the sterilization chambers themselves. As I described it, after they've let the stuff do its fumigation work, they suck it out of the chamber with a pump. That goes to a treatment device. And then, as I said, they sweep the chamber with nitrogen to try to flush out as much of the free ethylene oxide as they can. That goes to a scrubber. And then, once they've done all that, they've got as much out as they can, they open up the door, and that's when what they call the back vent is used. And basically, it's a personal protection device because somebody's got to go in with a fork truck and get the stuff out of the sterilization chamber. So they turn on the vent, so there's air blowing from the outside into the chamber so that the person operating the forklift isn't exposed to excessive amounts of ethylene oxide. So that's what's called the back vent, and that also is tied into a scrubber. And that's the job that they did just recently, in July or August of this year. Previously, that back vent had not been tied into a pollution control device, so now it is, and I saw it with my own eyes today. And then, as I said, you take the stuff out, put it in the aeration room to let it vent off a little bit more. In that whole room, actually they have 3 of them, each of those 3 rooms has a scrubber on it so that emissions from that don't go out into the environment.
Does Sterigenics operate 24 hours, 7 days a week? And are there certain weather patterns or a specific time of day when ethylene oxide lingers longer in an area?
That's our understanding. It's a continuous operation. In terms of weather patterns, certainly during the night, when the atmosphere is more stable and the winds are lighter, there could be. a tendency for pollution levels to be higher closer to the facility. During the daytime, you have more mixing and generally higher wind, so the pollution can get dispersed farther away. So nighttime would probably be the time when you might see the higher levels.
What happens to the ethylene glycol? Does it go down the drain to the sewer system? Is this a permitted event? Can an ETO spill enter a sewer drain? Oh, I changed that to, can an ethylene glycol spill enter a sewer drain?
Thank you. So first of all, as was alluded earlier by the Stop Sterigenics folks, it is a byproduct from the scrubber, and they do sell it as a product. They do have a secondary containment in case there should be a spill. There was one in 2013, as was also alluded to earlier at the beginning, the earlier presentation. They do not have a permit for a discharge because that's not contemplated. They presume that they are going to collect it and then sell it as a product. And when they had the spill in 2013, that was considered, kind of using our legal terminology, an unpermitted discharge, and so that was why we refer that over to the Attorney General's office as a part of that lawsuit in 2013. I know you've got a lot of other questions, but there were two things that you didn't get an answer in the last panel. I just want to spend 30 seconds addressing them. One, there was a question about when the community should expect the cancer cluster study to be concluded, and we've heard a couple times in testimony in Springfield during various legislative hearings that the State Department of Public Health is expediting that, and they hope to have that done in February or beginning of March. The second question I wanted to quickly address, I'm sorry for taking you off here, but the question was, should the community be concerned about either ETO or glycol in drinking water? And Illinois EPA is working with the DuPage County Department of Public Health to really address that issue. And the county health department has taken the lead on doing the canvassing. And I really want to spend 2 seconds on this because this is really very, very important. They've reached out by mail. They have set up a website for people to provide information so that we can determine where there are private wells so we can do sampling. And we need access agreements to be able to do sampling at these locations. We're focusing right now on a half-mile radius surrounding the Sterigenics facility, but we're also canvassing a full mile radius as well. And the reason why I want to dwell on this for a second is because so far we're not getting a lot of response back. I know the health department is going out tomorrow to physically knock on doors, but we've gotten 3 access agreements within that half-mile radius so far, and 44 between the half-mile and mile. So if you live in that radius, if you live in close proximity to the facility, if you know someone that does and they have gotten a letter or someone left a door hanger on their door asking them to reach out to the community health department to get us an access agreement so we can do that testing, please, it's really very, very important. We want to be able to have a complete analysis of what's out there. So, sorry, I piled.
If somebody has a well and it has not received any notification, is there somebody that they can contact to have their well tested?
Absolutely. So, we're working with the county health department, so they should certainly reach out to the DuPage County Department of Public Health to do so. Again, as I said, we're focusing on that half-mile radius. We want to hit every private well within the half-mile and then extend out from there. I think it was alluded to earlier, I think, Bill, you touched on this very briefly, that, and Illinois EPA would agree, we don't expect to see ETO or glycol in any of the private well sampling that we do, but that's why we're doing it, out of an abundance of caution, to make sure that really is the case.
This question is for Chief or Inspector Link. Is Sterigenics treated as 2 facilities or as 1 when it comes to enforcing regulations?
It's 2 separate buildings, so it's being treated as 2.
Okay, and then Director Messina, does IEPA treat it as 2 facilities or as 1?
The Sterigenics facility?
Correct.
1 facility.
So to clarify, the fire department treats it as 2 facilities and IEPA treats it as 1 facility.
The permitting scheme that we operate would treat it as 1. The environmental law would treat it as 1 facility.
The fire department has adopted the International Fire Code, and the International Fire Code, a lot of things differ depending on the size of the building and what's being done in the building. So we have no other choice but to consider it two different facilities. And I think maybe one of the things that is being referred to is, because I've been asked, is this a loophole to be able to store more materials? Well, they can store more materials, but I don't know that I'd call it a loophole. It's two different buildings, so we inspect them differently, and they're separate.
So each building is inspected as a separate facility?
Correct.
That has to meet the requirements on an individual basis?
Yes.
Has the EPA been monitoring air quality since Sterigenics opened in 1984? And is there a record of the air quality reports from 1984 till now?
Air measurements for ethylene oxide just started a couple of weeks ago. That's the 8 network site that we started up, and I think there's a map somewhere around here on one of the walls showing the locations, and I had it up there earlier tonight. But no, we have not been monitoring for ethylene oxide up until just recently.
Is the third party conducting the testing owned by Sterigenics or have a financial connection?
Yeah, I'm going to elaborate on the last question, and then I'll ask you to repeat that question. So a lot of people were unhappy with the answer that said we've only just started ambient monitoring for ethylene oxide, but the country's a big place, so I want everyone to understand that that's not any kind of value judgment on Willowbrook or anything more than the fact that we regulate hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of chemical substances. We regulate those emissions from hundreds and thousands of different types of sources, as I said earlier, from steel mills to petroleum refineries to ethylene oxide sterilization facilities. As much as we would like to spend a lot more money doing what we do have limited resources, and so we have to carefully pick the places where we spend the money and take the time to deploy monitoring networks. And we do that for the very most important pollutants that affect the very most people, like smog in cities. We have nationwide monitoring networks. Soot is a widespread problem. We have nationwide monitoring networks for that. Ethylene oxide is very important to the Willowbrook community, but in the grand scheme, it's not a compound that's used very widely at all across the nation. So historically, that's not the kind of chemical we as the federal government would require ambient monitoring for, because it's much more limited in its use and much more limited in its effect. So, that's why we do what we do. And, as Mike said, we have started, where we see issues, as we've seen in Willowbrook, then, we will target resources and use our resources to do site-specific monitoring, and that's what we started to do here.
And in answer to your question, it's an independent stack testing company, no financial ties to the company.
Who chose the company?
I believe that the facility would have chosen the company. However, Illinois EPA and US EPA both reviewed the protocol that was submitted. The protocol must comply with the regulations that are set forth in the NESHAP. We both had Illinois EPA and US EPA, as well as representatives of the village, were all present. And then the stack test was independently reviewed by the agency and our stack test experts, as well as US EPA.
Well, we've got probably a number of questions about the stack test and all that was done there, because you're basing a lot of you're putting a lot of weight on what's in that stack test, and how much the emissions are reported, my understanding, by what the calculations on the stack test are. Okay, it's self-reporting, and it's really a factor of how much ethylene oxide went in, multiplied by what's our emissions efficiency. There's no monitor up there day in, day out measuring this. So the stack test results are critical to knowing how much is emitted. So we have a lot of questions about that, including, who was the company that did it, who chose them, and why was there only a limited number of witnesses allowed to that test?
Right. So let me give my crack, and then I'll hand it to Mike, and you can get a third version of this. We require a lot of stack testing in a lot of places every single year. It probably happens every single day in multiple places around the country. What we do is we make the people do it. So there's legal obligation through our regulations. In this case, Sterigenics did it because we asked them to. We didn't have to issue a legal order, but this is a very powerful tool that we use across the board, across the nation, because actual measurements of pollution are really, really important to us, because that tells us exactly what's being emitted from these facilities. But we make the companies do it. So there's nothing inherently wrong with that as long as they do it right. Right. Yeah. So,
Okay, folks.
That's okay. I mean, this is a community meeting. That's why we're here.
We'll get there.
Yeah. So thank you. But I'll elaborate on some of the protections we have, because even though we make them do it in a very particular way. So they have to develop a detailed plan that explains exactly how they're going to do the testing. They send it to us to review and approve before they take the first step. Once we review and approve the plan, they're authorized to go forward with the testing, but we get to be there. And we being not me, I'm not a stack testing expert, but guys like Ned get to be there. And Ned was there, so you can hear from Ned if you want to hear from the guy himself who saw it happen. But we do that as a protection to make sure that they have a plan, we've reviewed and approved it, and then to implement the plan, we get to look over their shoulder and make sure it's done right. So it's a combined effort, but at the end of the day, it's important to us that the people who are emitting are the people that have to do this, but they have to do it in a very, very deliberate way according to rules that we set and rules that we make them follow.
All right. Well, since Sterigenics emission tests only measured the reduction of the back vent emissions, what plans does the IEPA or the US EPA have to determine the total ethylene oxide emissions from each plant during normal, full-scale operations? This is especially significant since at Building 1 there's separate emission sources for sterilization chambers emissions and back vent emissions, and at Building 2, where all the sterilizer emissions, back vent emissions, and aeration room emissions are treated by one emissions control system.
So first of all, I would agree with everything you just said as the lead up to that question. One point that I think is important, and then I'll follow up to answer your question. The reason why the tests on September 20th and 21st just measured that portion from the back vents was because we were determining the effectiveness of the controls that were in place and the construction permit that Illinois EPA issued to them in June of this year. So really, that test was limited, and you're absolutely right, it was limited to confirm what we thought would happen after they installed the venting that we authorized via that construction permit. Now, the question that you ask is absolutely critical about testing the facility as a whole, and I would absolutely agree with you. And this is something that I personally have had conversations with the agency, has had conversations with the Illinois Attorney General's office, and I think that's coming sooner rather than later. It's important, and I agree with you.
When do you think there'd be a full-scale test?
Fairly soon. And we're just, and I'm being, listen, I
understand if you don't have a date, but we're trying to.
No date, and I think this is important, and I understand why you're asking the question, because it's an important one. It's one of the, we're looking at a lot of different options as a part of the enforcement matter that we've sent over to the Attorney General's office. We're working together, and it's one of those items that is part of those discussions that we're having with that office.
And we do need to understand total emissions so we can do an accurate risk assessment. As I mentioned earlier, it's the fugitives, it's the leaks, what's coming out of the vents and the doors, the things that cannot be measured with the routine type of stack testing that we do. We don't have standard protocols for for capturing and measuring those leaks. So that's what we need to get information on from some of our air monitoring and some of the other data collection. That's critical in order for us to characterize the fugitives and know what the total emissions are.
Okay. One more on that is, do you have plans to install continuous emissions monitoring systems?
We are not planning to do that, no.
Well, why wouldn't you require it, I guess would be the question. So we know, rather than just, an extrapolation from one stack test times the amount of input. That's not really an accurate measure of the volume that's coming out of that building, and hasn't been for 34 years. And you're doing your risk assessments based on those numbers.
Yeah, so when we require someone to do emissions control or install emissions controls, it's really, really important to us to make sure it's done right. Most of the time, we don't require people to measure the actual pollution that's coming out of the stack because that's hard. It's very, very hard to do, and it's very, very expensive in most cases. So most of the time, we assure compliance in other ways, but in ways that give us confidence that it's being done right. So for instance, sometimes, and Sterigenics doesn't do this, but a simple example is sometimes we require people to put an incinerator on their emissions to burn them up, make sure they all go away. Well, we know if an incinerator is kept at a given temperature like 1400 degrees or 1500 degrees, we're going to get really, really good combustion. So we don't need to measure what's coming out of the stack because we know if it's 1500 degrees, we're getting virtually total destruction. Here they don't use it, they use scrubbers, they're a little bit more complicated. So we look at other things like how much are they recirculating through the scrubber and how much pressure does it take, pressure drop through the scrubber. So there are things we look at, but using engineering principles, if we pick the right things and we make them monitor those things, then we can be really sure that those devices, those pollution control devices are working really well. So the bottom line is compliance assurance is really, really important to us, but that doesn't always mean a machine, measuring at the end of the event. We can do it very reliably in other ways.
What has changed to make emission controls in the back vents suddenly feasible? The EPA and the ethylene oxide industry removed the rule about controlling back vents after it was determined it was too dangerous after the explosion in Ontario, California.
So as Bill said earlier, we established emission standards under the Clean Air Act for a number of different industrial source categories, commercial sterilizers being one of them. In 1994, EPA established the first rule for this sector, for commercial sterilizers. A few years after that, we learned about the explosion issue. And we were very concerned from a public safety standpoint about that. At that time, we did not realize ethylene oxide was as potent as we know it to be today. So when we went through and amended the rule in 2001 and then did a risk assessment in 2006, we had a potency value that was 60 times less than what we know it to be today. When we did that risk assessment in 2006, it showed that there was not going to be a problem in terms of public exposure to ethylene oxide levels without controls on the back vent, uncontrolled back vent emissions, based on the toxicity value we had at the time. Now we know that is not the right number, that it is 60 times more potent. So as we are going through a review of that rule, which as Bill mentioned earlier, we've started recently and should have a proposal out next year that you all can comment on. We will be using, as Kelly said earlier, we will be using that new potency value.
I think
the science has changed,
yeah.
and we've taken that into account in our regulatory
I think the
process.
question is more of a safety question, as since the thought was that the explosion previously happened due to the back vent issue that they had, has the technology on back venting scrubbing changed so that to lower the risk, or is the decision made that the risk of explosion is worse than or is not as bad as the risk of giving cancer?
Yeah, our rule did not specify a certain type of control technology. Some in the industry use scrubbers, others use thermal oxidizers. It was the thermal oxidizers, the thermal heat treatment with this very volatile chemical that presented the public health safety issue. We established a rule that was not specific to technology. It was a general rule for the industry.
If I can add, in California, that was largely in part due to operator error. Somebody bypassed safety devices because there was a problem with the machine. They also, where Sterigenics is in here, they have monitoring systems that they didn't have there. So yes, some things are better.
So we do need to wrap up this panel. Another question or two?
Given the recent spill in Delaware, do you believe Sterigenics should have told the community about the emissions of October 2013 and glycol spill in 2013, as well as the recent one in September of this year, 2018?
I can say that Sterigenics should notify us when there's a spill on their facility, and again, we're in conversation with them about that. And one of the things we learned from this whole process, from all you people telling us, you know, what's important to you and what's going on, that's kind of why we started this whole notification system. So whatever we know, we are going to pass along to the public. And if it's just, you know, if it's just a small something, we'll say it's just a small something. But we're hopeful that Sterigenics will include us a little quicker in some of this information.
The one thing that, you know, we don't want to sugarcoat things for people. They're not required to report to us. There's no, like, there's a fire alarm system in this building that goes to a central station somewhere else and we get a call. There's no system like that. Their monitoring system doesn't notify us that there's a problem.
Oh, I understand, Chief. My question was directed more towards the IEPA.
It's okay. About the notification portion?
Yes.
Right. So, you know, right now, existing state law requires us to make certain notifications, but I think you're right. You know, it's one of those items that the public notice component is lacking. And it's one of the reasons we've drafted, legislation to address that issue and feel fully comfortable that that's something that should be done better, needs to be done better.
Didn't you oppose that legislation last week?
No. Last week there was notification. There's a whole bill that did a lot of things. Let me be very clear. Absolutely supportive of public notice. Absolutely.
I thought you opposed the bill.
Well, there were a lot of things.
Why was Governor Rauner and Sterigenics notified in December 2017 about the cancer risk by Sterigenics, and the public was not informed at that time? And I've got a second question on here. I won't have time for it, but the same question was asked as to why were the facilities up north in Waukegan and in Gurnee not notified?
Okay, a lot in that question. Let me start with the notification to the state of Illinois. So as EPA develops its National Air Toxic Assessment, we work very closely with our state partners to review and quality assure information. We generated some draft information very early on that we were sharing with states. They were reviewing that. It took several months to work through that process, but it was a very orderly, it was a very scientific process in order to make sure that we had the data right. And that was the information that we released in August of this year.
Who made the determination to tell Sterigenics in December?
As we work through and gather that information and review that information, we work closely with our state partners. We work with the facilities. They're the ones who report, self-report in many cases, that information to the state agencies. We need to verify that information with the state, with the reporting facilities to make sure that we got their numbers right.
It still didn't answer the question. Did the state notify Sterigenics or did the US EPA?
I'm not aware of us working directly with Sterigenics in that time frame.
It's absolutely my understanding that, as you noted, that US EPA was reaching out to those facilities to ensure that the inventory you had was complete, or to identify the gaps that you had. That's always been my understanding. So to answer your question specifically, Illinois EPA did not have any notification or any discussions with Sterigenics at that time about the review that US EPA was doing.
Okay, did you have a follow-on to that, or is
No, I just had one last question.
Okay, go ahead.
Director Messina, you were banned from issuing pollution permits under the Clean Water Act due to your lobbying activities before taking your current position. when it became evident that there was a possible water pollution issue from ethylene glycol leaks? Should you have recused yourself?
So first of all, both during the time that you're referencing and after that time is concluded, I've never issued, reviewed, or weighed in on any NPDES permit that we've issued. So I understand the question. It's just not a role of the director's office since I've had it, or previous directors. The directors don't weigh in on permitting decisions.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen, very much. Can we quickly get, I think Laura's coming on up, and let's move on to panel 3. Let's take about 15 minutes for this panel. There's only a few questions. Leave some time for panel 4, and you know, if we need to go 5 or 10 minutes after, we will do that. So, our panel 3 questioners.
Hi. What are the EPA plans moving forward, and how can the community stay involved?
Okay, I think some of you guys have already heard this alluded to, but we intend to have some ongoing dialogue with this community moving forward and making a lot of the same materials available to other communities. So as Mike mentioned, we're going to have a webinar as the data comes in to walk you through that data and help you understand the information that's coming from the monitoring. We also want to give some webinars on overviews of the National Air Toxic Assessment in a little bit more detail, our regulatory process, and other issues that come up. And the idea being that when we're ready to make decisions on the regulatory process and propose any regs, you have the background that you need to be able to comment on those rules and engage on them in as a productive way as possible. And so in that process, there was a question about how do we comment, and we'll go through that. There's ways of doing written submittals, there's ways of doing verbal submittals, and we'll walk through that process as well.
Is the EPA planning on setting regulation for ETO?
As Bill and Mike mentioned, we're already in the process of doing that. Collecting the data not only here from Sterigenics, but from facilities across the country. And using that information and the detailed information that we're developing, that's the first step in that regulatory process. And we are moving forward to do that, and I believe it was mentioned that we want to propose that this year.
What is the expected time frame for the regulation to be set?
So we're working on it, coming up, working through the data, working on proposal this year, and then the comment period happens, and then we will finalize the rule.
So just to clarify, so we've had a rule in place for this sector for almost 25 years. And we've reviewed it a couple of times already. The Clean Air Act requires us every 8 years to relook at our emission standards. Do we do it every 8 years? Sometimes not. Sometimes we're late.
When's the last time you did it?
Our last review for this particular sector was done in 2006. That means we're 4 years late. So we're working on it.
And in 2013,
we started in September, and we plan to propose the rule next year, probably middle of next year.
And in 2016, you reclassified ethylene oxide as a Class 1 carcinogen, correct?
Yes, the assessment that was done, as Bill talked about earlier, done by our Office of Research and Development, did identify this carcinogen, yes.
And this regulation that you're updating was not done until what happened at Sterigenics occurred last summer, right?
The update we're doing will take that, the new update we're doing will take that information into account.
Did you start this update before the ATSDR report went out this year?
No, we started that work in September after we released our National Air Toxics Assessment. When ATR released their report, our response to that, as Bill described earlier, is two-pronged. There's a regulatory approach we're taking to provide solutions under the Clean Air Act, but also this case-by-case review that we're doing for Sterigenics and several other facilities around the country to get reductions sooner, because the regulatory process, as he said, could take months, years. You can't wait months and years. You want action now.
We wanted action 5 years ago.
That's why we're doing this review, the case-by-case review.
So do these regulations also deal with handling ethylene oxide as well as emissions?
Deal with, I'm sorry.
The handling of ethylene oxide as well as emissions?
Where the rules that we have deal with the air emissions related to ethylene oxide.
And is the EPA taking into account propylene oxide as well as ethylene oxide?
Don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
And is there an updated risk assessment report that's due in 2019?
For, you mean our national assessment?
Yes, the
As Bill
national
said, we are
assessment.
not required under the law to do that. We do that because communities, states want information, and we want to understand what the risks are. We regulate air toxics differently under the Clean Air Act. We regulate based on risks, not on safe levels or air standards like we have for other pollutants, but based on risks. So we do this national assessment to help areas understand what the potential risks are in their communities. So are we going to do this again in 3 years? That's generally the schedule we've been on. I cannot promise that. It comes out of my office, but it is something we've already started. We just finished the last review. That came out in August. We've already begun the next one, and we'll try to get it out by 2019.
Let me add to that just a little bit. We develop our national emissions inventory, which is the starting point for the NADA, every 3 years for the criteria pollutants. It's required every 3 years for the criteria pollutants, and the toxics gets added to that. So when we do NADA, we use that information as a starting point, and we build from that. And that's why typically we do that in the NADA assessment around every 3 years, 3 or 4 years, so that it gives us the new set of data to start with.
Okay, so that'd be 2021. I said 2019, I misspoke.
I want to talk a little bit about the trans-2-butene issue that has come up recently.
So let me just hold this a second. I think we've spilled into the last session. Is that correct? This is not session 3.
Well, my first question was,
We did the first few were that session. I just want to let you know everybody's available to answer these questions, so it's not just the folks on the table. That's all.
Go ahead.
what was the purpose of publicizing the potential interference of trans-2-butene on the air testing?
So it was new information for us, and we wanted to be transparent with y'all to make sure that you were aware of the new information when we had it. You know, we've heard from the community members that you wanted to be kept informed as we had that information, and so we wanted to make sure when we had certainty about it, we had certainty on how the labs were going to handle quantifying the ethylene oxide and the trans-2-butene, that we let you guys know about that as soon as we could.
Does this potential interference invalidate the ATSDR report as Sterigenics claims?
No. As Kelly mentioned earlier, that was a snapshot in time based on the data that they had at the time, using the screening level emission, or the draft emissions information, and a grab sample using that old data. And as Kelly mentioned, that report gave, if that plant continued to operate at that level, then there was a health concern. And the recommendations from ATSDR were to reduce emissions and move forward with a regulatory process. And that's exactly what we've been doing based on that report. So their report was not wrong. And what it did, what the interference issue did tell us is that we need to account for that to make sure that we're giving more accurate information for future assessments.
So the potential...
Mark wants to say something to that.
Right, so Mark Johnson with ATSDR. So we issued our report in August of last year, of this past summer, based on both the modeling and the measured levels of ethylene oxide in the community. Given the uncertainty about the interference, which still is uncertain whether it was actually interfered with or not, we are going to plan to make a slight revision in our document to reflect that our assessment is going to be based on the modeling information, which confirms the results of the testing. And we believe our conclusions and recommendations are still supported. But we want to be clear about that so that this interference issue does not change our opinion in any way.
Were there any detectable levels of trans-2-butene in the original ambient air testing of May 2018?
Yeah, well, we did not analyze for trans-butene at that time. As I said before, measurements for this particular chemical, ethylene oxide, has been very challenging, and we don't have a lot of experience with it. So as we've done further research, as science has become available, that's the information we wanted to share with people. So we did not quantify it back in May, but we will be quantifying it going forward with the new measurements we're collecting.
So were the news reports then based on pure speculation?
I don't want to comment on necessarily the news reports. We were just trying to provide a statement and share, as Laura said just a minute ago, we wanted to be completely transparent with you and share with you the latest information we had about the science of measuring for this particular chemical.
Well, there are recent news reports that said that the EPA gave an all clear. Are those accurate?
That was not the statement that we issued.
And where did the EPA learn of this possible interference? From who?
We learned it from our scientists as we were starting to get experience with measuring ethylene oxide. We were actually talking with our laboratory about how they did the analysis and determined that there was this possible interference and that we needed to be more careful as we did the analysis in the laboratory so that we were purely and strictly identifying the ethylene oxide levels and not possibly looking at other chemicals.
And when did the EPA learn this?
Just very recently, which is why we just issued the statement last week.
How recent is very recently?
I don't know the exact date, but we've been looking at the laboratory technique. As I said before, we don't have a lot of experience measuring this chemical. And as we were preparing to take these measurements and working with our laboratory, we wanted to make sure that we were getting accurate and reliable information. And do you want?
No, I mean, it's with the last 2 to 3 weeks. There.
Did folks hear that? He said within the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Was it the EPA's intent to state that due to this potential interference, there is no cause for concern?
We did not say that, and we are here tonight because we think there still is potential concern. And as Bill said very clearly earlier, we are committed to making sure that we find a solution for this community.
Okay, thank you. If I can ask Ned a question? You were present for the stack testing in September at Sterigenics, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you understood the way the facility ran, how many chambers it had, and what its cycles were?
Within reason. So the way the test was designed was to test each back vent at a time. So each test was one back vent emission process.
Okay. Do you know how many chambers Sterigenics runs in any given time?
I do not have that information.
And how many chambers were run at the time of the stack test?
At the time of the stack vent, once again, each test run was one back vent emission, so one chamber being vented.
Okay. So they could be running all of their chambers on a 24/7 basis, but you only tested for one chamber.
I would not want to speculate that. I do not know what their standard procedure is.
But you tested one chamber.
But we tested one chamber at a time.
And why is that?
That's how the test plan was designed and approved.
But why? Why didn't you have them running like their normal given day when you were testing the stacks?
That's a difficult question to answer. I believe the test plan was designed similar to how the subpart O was designed, which allows one cycle vent out of one chamber to be is basically a test run. So the back vent emissions aren't as you brought up before, aren't incorporated into the subpart. So this is something that's completely separate from the from the subpart. So in working with Illinois EPA, we designed a test program that we thought would effectively challenge the removal efficiency of the scrubber device. One thing to think about when you talk about these scrubbers, just because you inject more material doesn't necessarily make it a harder test to run. In many cases, and as perhaps in this one, injecting a lower concentration actually made it more difficult to show the removal efficiency.
Who prepared the test plan?
The facility did.
And did any of this have to do with their construction permit?
There was a requirement to conduct the SAC test. That was a condition of the construction permit.
And did the construction permit allow them to just test one chamber running?
Fair question. I don't know the answer to the construction permit detail. Happy to get that for you though, so I apologize.
Well, just as a follow-up, I mean, from our looking at this, when the stack test was done, it was done with one empty chamber using approximately 30 pounds of ethylene oxide. When Sterigenics' actual production is 5 chambers that would use 400 pounds if they were full. Would that impact those final results? I mean, I understand what Ned just said, that you can potentially get a different result from a lower amount. Would it have changed the result potentially? I don't think he's listening.
I think you got silent.
Yeah.
Bill, there was a question for Ned.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
I'm sorry. What was the question?
I can do it a little more quickly. Since you weren't aware of how many chambers they have or how much they process, we can fill that in for you. As far as we know, the stack testing was done with you guys with one empty chamber using approximately 30 pounds of EO. When their actual production is 5 chambers that would use 400 pounds if they were full, would that affect those final results?
Well, actually, for the test method, for the test runs for the back vent emission, they were using a full chamber, so it wasn't an empty chamber for the back vent testing. As far as for the design of the test, I'm not sure why it was approved that way.
Did you ask Sterigenics? Did you go back to them and ask, once they give you their test plan, you don't go back to them and ask them the reason for why they made the decisions that they made?
Oh, once again, this kind of speaks to Illinois. It was Illinois' decision, since this test was not part of a subpart, so we did not design the test program for back vent emissions. There was back and forth in the approval process, so I wish I could answer that question, but that's ultimately up to the Illinois EPA and their...
So Lauren, obviously I didn't review the testing protocol, but I know that you have my email address, so if you put those questions together, I'll respond to all of them. I apologize. But I mean, I think there are 2 points to be made here. One, I think that the testing that occurred on September 20th and 21st was narrow in scope, and it was to determine the efficacy of the back vents and the venting that was installed pursuant to that construction permit. And this goes to your question 15 minutes ago, and that is that there has to be a site-wide, more global, more broad test beyond just that narrow scope from what occurred on the September 20th and 21st.
So what are you going to do to make that change?
I already addressed that. We're actually in talks. That has to happen. It will happen. Sorry? When? Those are the conversations we're having with the Attorney General's office. So it needs to happen sooner rather than later. I just don't want to commit because it's not just my decision.
So so a general question then, sort of related to that and bringing in another element. The risk assessment from 2014 was based on, I believe, self-reporting from Sterigenics that they were releasing in 2014 5,566 pounds of ethylene oxide. Under your current permit regulations, they could be emitting up to 36,400 pounds a year if they chose to do that. Legally, they could do that based on what you guys allow them to do. So if all that we're talking about today involves much lower amounts than what you allow them to do, who's to say that once you leave town and your air testing monitors are gone, they're not going to ramp up? And how do we know that? I mean, is anyone extrapolating that to see what that actually means for this community should they decide to ramp up?
So there are two components to that question. Both of them are important. So the reason that you're referencing the number that you reference is that is when we permit facilities, they generally fall into various categories. A cap source is a larger source, and so they have to be at a certain threshold. So you're right, they are allowed, even though they've never come close to that point, but they are allowed to.
Not since 1999.
Right. So, but they don't now. Now, I do think that one of the things that we're actually taking a look at, and this is, because there are enforcement discussions going on, I want to be careful about what I say that we're talking about and what I don't, because we obviously, with the Attorney General's office, we don't want to leave any option uncovered in terms of moving forward. We want to look at all of our possible legal avenues, and I think that's exactly one of the things that we're talking about. I think it's a great point. I agree with you.
So why haven't the US EPA or the Illinois EPA shut Sterigenics down?
So I'll speak to Illinois EPA, and then you can address the federal piece of that. So as the facility currently operates today, it is in compliance with the NESHAP, the National Mission Standard for that hazardous air pollutant, and the permit conditions. Now, as Mr. Wareham led off right at the beginning, things have changed, and that was the basis, that increased risk factor, which we don't regulate based on risk. We rely on US EPA to adopt those regulations, and then we use them ourselves like most states do, subpart O, I believe. However, because of that increased risk, that was the basis for our referral to the Attorney General's office, and we're taking a look at all of the legal options that we have.
And from EPA's perspective, you know, the Clean Air Act gives us a range of tools to address emissions from facilities. We have one tool in the Clean Air Act to be able to address imminent and substantial endangerment, but it's not a perfect tool for this situation. And so shutting down a facility is a very high hurdle to be able to kind of move that way. So it's something that is there, but it's really not a great fit for this and other situations. There are other reasons we use imminent and substantial endangerment, but for shutting down facilities, it's a very difficult process.
And so turning a little bit, one of the concerns our community has, and you saw at the beginning, is that, you know, it does seem like there is, and I'll just use the term revolving door, between people who work at the EPA, lobbyists, this back and forth, and there's a lack of trust. And I'm not taking a cheap shot, this is a genuine question to Mr. Wareham. You know, you're being held up so high as the top air person in the United States. Looking at your bio, prior to this job, you worked as a lawyer and a lobbyist on behalf of major industrial companies and advocated, according to some interpretations at least, for looser environmental regulations. I would like you or anyone to explain to us how do we process that as human beings and people who are impacted by this toxin in our air? How do we trust you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, well, that's what somebody just said, good question. It is a good question. I came to EPA because I wanted to, not because anybody made me. I came to EPA because I have a firm commitment to air pollution control and protecting public health and the environment. I was a lawyer in private practice. You know, between the time I left the agency, you know, I was with the EPA from 2001 to 2007, then left, was back in private practice, and then rejoined EPA a little bit more than a year ago right now. So my job right now is to be the top federal air regulator, and I take that job very, very seriously. And I think it's important to know, you know, I have a large and talented and very dedicated and skilled staff that work with me, and you've seen some of those people here, you're seeing some of those people now. And I think it's really important for all of you to know that while I have a lot of influence on what the air program does, The people who really keep the machine running are the people that you see here sitting and standing around me. And
Thank you. We have very little time left.
okay.
I have a question for Dr. Buchanan. Mutagen, what does that mean?
Something that causes mutations in cells.
And is ETO a mutagen?
I think so. Thank you.
You don't know if ethylene oxide?
I know ethylene oxide is a known carcinogen, and a mutation is one of the first steps to cancer developing.
And let me ask you, doctor, what level of ETO is safe?
Well, the general understanding of carcinogens is that you can develop cancer at any level of exposure.
So would you agree that no level of ETO is safe?
I would agree that no level of ETO is safe.
Thank you.
One of the things that we continue to hear from Sterigenics and from lobbyists at the ACC and the IMA is that ethylene oxide is produced naturally by our bodies and by decaying fruit and other sources. How does an industrial single source emitter of this magnitude of ethylene oxide compare to that type of emission from the human body or other natural sources?
This is Kelly, I can take that. We humans do make some ethylene oxide. I know that there was a study that Sterigenics put on, I think on their website, that said we do make 19,000 times more than what the limit is. We've obtained that study and we have our scientists reviewing it. And once they're done reviewing it, we'll put our view of that. We'll let you guys know what it is. But we do emit some ethylene oxide from our bodies. But what we're studying is what's coming out of Sterigenics. So there's kind of two things going on. Does that make sense?
It does, and I would be interested in Dr. Buchanan's answer in the clinical setting on that question. If, one of the things we heard at the first forum from Mark Johnson was, tell your physicians that this is going on, and many of us have told our physicians, and they're like, what? Yeah, I don't know what that is. And so then when the reporting that's out there is so magnified and these tales about, basically we're giving ourselves cancer by breathing ETO to ourselves, it creates a difficult situation for us to talk to our physicians in a clinical setting when they're being fed information like that. So I'm curious, Dr. Buchanan, what your take on that is, both the issue of natural production of ethylene oxide by the human body, but also in a clinical setting. How are every parent, every person in this room, how are we supposed to be talking to our doctors about this?
Well, as a family physician for almost a decade, I can guarantee you that the vast majority of physicians do not receive any training in exposure to environmental chemicals. I mean, absolutely none in medical schools. So that's a problem. So most of the doctors, your personal physicians that you go to, are not going to know about this. That's the reason that the health department, the county health department here, organized the lecture last night at Hinsdale Hospital. So Dr. Johnson and I gave a presentation on ethylene oxide to really try to help the physicians respond to your questions. So that's something we are trying to remedy. That's also one of the reasons that the EPA and ACTSDR fund these Children's Environmental Health Centers in each region. We have a hotline because they recognize that physicians can't answer these questions, don't have enough background. And so we have centers of excellence in each region, and we are the center of excellence in the Midwest for doctors and residents, but primarily for physicians to be able to call us and get advice on how to talk to patients. Now, the second part of your question, what was it? It was about doctors not knowing.
It was the question about the human production of ethylene oxide versus a single industrial emission.
That is not something that is generally known, is generally accepted, and it doesn't appear in the in the deep literature on environmental exposures and animal exposures, it just doesn't come up. So I tend to, I looked at that study too that the EPA scientists are analyzing now, and I tried to look up some of the references and got a little lost in the detail, I have to admit, so thank God the EPA, gosh, the EPA has some experts that are going to be able to look at it, but from my impression right now is that is not a significant source of ethylene oxide in the human body. I mean, compared to the emissions from stereogenics.
And Dr. Buchanan, where can some of the residents go to get tested?
For ethylene
For
oxide?
ethylene oxide. What type of blood test can they take?
There is a urine test and a blood test. I would not know where that is done. Hospitals, I doubt that hospitals do this type of test. I haven't looked it up, but I'm pretty sure that this is not something that a routine lab would be able to do. We are not generally recommending testing for ethylene oxide because, as you've heard over and over tonight, so little is known about this chemical. There is no known level that has a meaning that we can interpret. So if something comes back 100 micrograms per deciliter, I wouldn't know what that meant compared to somebody whose level is one microgram per deciliter. What does that mean? It's a carcinogen. The longer you're exposed to it, the more you're exposed to, the higher your risk of cancer becomes.
So for a question for all of you, does that mean that Willowbrook and the surrounding facilities are the test subjects for all of these studies that are going to be taking place? For children, for adults, for exposure, for long-term?
I don't think I can answer that. I think what we will do...
I can take the answer is absolutely not. We're looking into ethylene oxide in many communities in the country, including Willowbrook. And we're going to get a good understanding of what is in the air and let you guys know what your risk is, and we're going to be coming back and talking to you about it. We're also reducing that risk.
Yeah. Ma'am, I see, but it's 10 o'clock and we're gonna
Can I ask one last question? Because I think it's relevant to what the community wants to know about the detection instruments. It's a quick one, I think.
If you, ma'am, if you come on up and work with the questioners, they can ask a question for you. But it is 10 o'clock. I'm sorry. Well, I'll defer to the questioners.
Go ahead. Ask. You have a question. Ask your question. We want to hear your question.
Hang on, I need to get you a microphone, ma'am.
Excuse me. I developed, to start with, just adult onset asthma 3 years after we moved in 1990. I have a daughter that had cancer. I eventually got more and more multi-systemic problems. I eventually was referred through 4 layers of types of doctors to a mitochondrial disease expert. There weren't any in Illinois. I had to go out of pocket to go to Massachusetts General Hospital. I've been taking what's called a mitochondrial disease cocktail for many years now. Very expensive. No insurance covers it in Illinois. The only state that covers it is Massachusetts. And it's a big burden financially on the family. I happen to be able to pursue things more because I was autodidactic and I used to be intelligent before all this happened. Everybody wouldn't have the resources to be able to afford these supplements, especially high cost or large dosages of CoQ10, but it gets very specific and I couldn't afford to keep following up on it. There is most likely a lot more people would have something like this and be most likely undiagnosed because the average family physicians are not aware of this. Many people, as they continue to get more and more multisystemic problems, it spreads through the systems depending on which organs use the most oxygen. This is a burden because it's been considered a rare disease. They're finding out more about it. But I know that it was brought up that the ethylene oxide was a mutagen and could cause chromosome changes, and this is exactly what this is. So I just wanted to bring that up and make people aware of it. Thank you.
So we are just going over time. If there's one more question you want to ask, and then we'll wrap this up.
A couple really quick ones. The first is that it's been mentioned several times that the amount of ethylene oxide that you would like to be able to measure is not able to be captured at such low amounts by the current technology that exists. What is being done to develop that technology? What is the time frame on that? Are we in a holding pattern? Is it being worked on? And if you could answer kind of quickly, because I have one other question after that.
Thank you. As we said, we're just learning. We're learning how to measure this compound. We haven't been doing this that long. We do have multiple research efforts using a number of different techniques, some optical. Can you hear me okay?
Maybe hold it a little closer.
Okay, all right. So we're trying to evaluate a number of different techniques that would give us the ability to read down at those lower levels, at 0.02 micrograms per meter is our target. But we're at the start right now. Once again, this is research. I do not know how long it'll take, but I can tell you that we are on it, and we are trying to find a way.
And then there's some literature from 2002 from the US EPA entitled Replacing Ethylene Oxide and Another Chemical, basically saying environmental best practices for healthcare facilities. Would it be the position of the EPA today that if there was an alternative method to ethylene oxide, you would support that replacement? And why in 2002 was this something that was being promulgated or disseminated by US EPA? And is it still something that you're looking into, or this is over, I don't even know how many years ago at this point. Where does that stand?
Yeah, I think we got a previous question earlier tonight about substitute approaches, other technologies that could be used. That's something we're going to have to look into and give.
But my question is about the position of the EPA, if that were to exist. In 2002, there is an actual paper document that is created by the US EPA. Consider taking the hospitals for a healthy environment pledge. Find out more. In 2002, that was something that was done by your organization, or your agency, excuse me. What's the status of that position?
Yeah, I need to actually see what you are looking at. I don't have that in my possession. I'd like to see that. And we are looking at the rule for commercial sterilizers. We'll also look at the rule for hospital sterilizers. So thank you for sharing this.
But knowing that ethylene oxide is a carcinogen, if there was a replacement method that worked just as well, would the US EPA support the use of that? Would, environmentally speaking, and from an environmental protection standpoint, is that something that you guys would want to see take over that market?
I think we will want to look at that as part of reviewing the rule for both commercial sterilizers and hospital sterilizers.
So you can't stand here and say a representation for the US EPA that if there was a better method that didn't put a carcinogen into the air, that the Environmental Protection Agency, as a general statement, hypothetically, that you guys would not support that being used instead of a carcinogen? Are you saying you cannot stand there and say that?
That would certainly be a very strong factor in us reviewing and possibly changing our rule, yes.
Okay, if you just wait one sec, I want everybody to if you haven't signed up for the general information, you can ask at that web address there, eto@epa.gov. You can get put onto the mailing list and make sure you stay in touch. And this is the website where EPA will be posting all of the information. You can link from there. I just want to thank everybody for your patience and your civility tonight. I'm going to hand it off to Bill just to close this out.
I'll be quick. Thank you for being here. You heard me say it several times tonight. This is a community meeting, and I really appreciate your input, your reaction, your comments. We're in the middle of a process. We'll keep pushing forward, and we will be back. Thank you very much for being here.
Good night.